Hey, man.
Hello.
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for doing this. I'm a
Oh, thank you
huge,
for inviting
huge
me.
fan. No,
Oh,
my
thank you.
pleasure. My pleasure. Huge fan of your music. Been listening for years already, and for today's agenda, really learn more about your journey as a whole, not just like in terms of what you have musically done, but hopefully take a step back and look at even a bigger picture of how you first of all ended up making music, but yeah, look at that kind of journey, and then maybe jump into some specifics in terms of mixing and stuff like that, if that sounds half
Yeah, that
decent.
sounds perfect to me.
Cool. Just to give people some context to who you are, what you do, um, your you might have to help me with the pronunciation, getting the pronunciation of your surname right. But Dan Behrens, is
That is
that correct?
correct.
That is correct. That's your real full name. Is that, by the way, Behrens strikes me a bit Nordic. Is that
German.
German? Okay. What does it mean?
I think it literally has to do with bears, but I don't actually remember. I know that in Germany there is a Baron's coat of arms that is covered with peach trees.
Nice. Have you
Eh,
considered incorporating that to your logo?
No, I haven't, but that's an interesting idea. Maybe I will in the future.
Yeah, you should look into that. It's probably like something like Berenson is probably close to that. So that would, I don't know, be like son of bear. I don't know. But
And you're in Sweden?
Finland.
Finland.
So across the pond
I've
from
only met
those
one
dirty
Finnish
Swedes.
person. Yeah. Uh,
Kidding. I
the
love my
Finnish person
Swedish
I
brother.
know, he's the a lighting and mixing engineer for a band called Machine Supremacy out of Sweden, I believe.
Yeah.
I did a tour with
Nice.
them a few years back, and
Good times.
they're very lovely dudes, fantastic musicians.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. It's Finland is very, very different. I mean, we're still part of the Nordic countries, but I mean, Norway, Sweden, Denmark are very sort of more alike, and Finns are kind of like the dark horse cousin. Everybody sort of makes fun of us, and I guess
I would never.
yeah. Well, I mean, you're not
I would love
a
to visit
Swede.
someday, to be honest.
It's a nice place. It's pretty. It's very different. Like a lot of forests, a lot of lakes, not a lot of like mountains and stuff like that, unless you go very up north. But but yeah, it's a nice place. The people are cool, and they're especially cool when it comes to foreigners. Like especially if you know come from the U.S. People tend to be super excited about that, and they want to speak English with you, and you know you're
Cool.
you're coming from the big world versus not the backdoor forest from here. So
The big world isn't that great. Um, Part of me wants to escape to the forest once in a while.
yeah, well, I mean, there's plenty behind this wall. So if you want to have a look, you're welcome to visit. Um, cool, but yeah, I mean, to continue on the on what you do. And by the way, if you want to take a break at any point, use the bathroom, anything, just let me know, and well, it's no issue. Um, but yeah, you're probably best known from your work as Danimal Cannon. Would that be
Correct.
the fairest assessment? Yeah. So basically, super hard hitting chiptune music. Obviously, there's scope depending on which album we're talking about, but yeah, very elaborate, intricate. I would say hard hitting chiptune music.
I'll take that as a high compliment. Thank you.
It's I'll that's probably the simplest non yeah, probably the simplest way of that I can put it. But
I think you put it quite well.
your music has so much so many layers, so much complexity that it's pretty unfair to try and summarize it very, very, very succinctly. But yeah, but otherwise, you've also done some soundtrack work for film and also
Um,
video games. But
a little bit. It's funny. I'm actually miscredited on Google, which I think there's another Dan Behrens
I
who.
was gonna, yeah, I wanted to ask about this because I did. I mean, this stuff was still, I think, from your sources, but as I was doing some research, I did find this other Dan Behrens, who is oddly close. Well, I mean, I think some kind of music. Was it? What does he do? I believe he selects music for different, films and stuff like that. I don't
Oh,
believe he's a.
gotcha. There's a German film. I think it's a gay comedy. I haven't actually seen it. That credits me as a composer. It's called Men to Kiss, and it's for some reason when you search my name in Google, it comes up because the composer's name was Dan Behrens. So they just automatically assumed that it was me, and I don't know how to change that, but whatever.
As long as the money finds your bank account, you're happy
Right.
with that.
I'm not getting paid for that, but yes.
Yeah.
I have done a bunch of like short film stuff though. Um, or I would almost call them like long form commercials, like anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour. But I haven't done any like feature film work.
Yeah. Yeah. And is most of the video game music you've done, is that under Danimal Cannon still, like
Usually, yeah.
credited?
I I know some people who have had artist names and then they sort of switch to their real name when it comes to certain composition work. I'm reminded of Jake Kaufman was releasing stuff under the name Vert for a really long time, and now he kind of goes by Jake Kaufman. And Disaster Piece, that's Rich. Although I think he probably releases stuff under Disaster Piece now. He does a lot of film work. He did the movie It Follows, and so he's stuck with his old chiptune name. So some people, I don't know, is it Nine Inch Nails or is it Trent Reznor? Well, and that's not even his real name, anyways. But
So he has many layers of this confusion
yeah,
going.
yeah. But generally, I release stuff under Danimal Cannon. And I've thought
Yeah.
about switching to releasing certain things under Dan Behrens, but I don't know. I think I'm going to go on the consistent brand identification thing. So when I play shows, that people know what I'm going to be performing, I guess.
Yeah. No, I've definitely noticed that. I mean, if you do artistically something distinctively different, then it's maybe like the incentive to separate the names becomes greater. If it's drastically different type of music, but I definitely have experienced the issues of diversifying too much because it's hard enough as it is to find listeners and fans and build your fan base and your brand, and now you're trying to do it on the side with something else. So generally, I find that pulling everything you do under one name, if at all possible, tends to be far better. Obviously, that's not to say that you can't do it the other way, but if you're a small fish in a big pond, then that certainly helps.
Right. I mean, we're all, working towards something greater, and any edge that you can sort of use um, that just makes things more efficient or makes things less difficult for the end user who, you're struggling to find an audience for. It's worth doing, I think.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely useful to direct people into one place instead of five or more. But cool. But yeah, I think even if you write music for video games, it's so in your case, at least, my perception or view of it is that it's sufficiently similar and quite, it clearly distinctively has your style and sound to it. So I find it very easy to attach that to the Danimal Cannon name, at least. So
It's sort of interesting. I valued very highly the versatility of different artists. Like when I was getting into video games and game composing and stuff like that, the idea that an artist like Jake Kaufman could make a house dance song and then an orchestral metal track and then do a piano, etude sounding like Bach or something. That sort of versatility to me is a huge strength. And so I didn't see the lack of focus as I don't know, like a negative. I saw it as a giant positive, something that, I wanted to embody. Like I wanted to be able to be versatile enough to make all kinds of different kinds of music. And to me, that's like hugely important in marketing yourself. Because a lot of times a client will ask you to do something because most of the clients that are hiring you are not musicians, and so they don't know what you can or can't do, and so they may ask you to do something that's far outside of your main scope, and you kind of have to adapt or be adaptable.
yeah, no, I completely agree. And one of the things that I've noticed is that, let's say I, as a composer, write kind of a broader spectrum of different types of styles or genres, or music in different sort of styles. Someone like yourself, who is an artist and appreciates a wider scope of things, and you've also done a wider scope of things. Someone like yourself can understand how it is that I could, let's say, write a soundtrack in a style that I haven't published before, because you sort of understand. You can listen to what I've done and sort of build a picture of what I probably can do or could potentially do. But someone who doesn't come from that kind of a background, I find that they find it very difficult you can't ask them to imagine what it's like for you to write a good soundtrack in this sort of a style. At least I find that as I've, um, offered my services as a composer to a game development company, most of them want to precisely see the thing that they want to put into their game, or at least have
Right.
it be in the same niche or niche. I don't know which pronunciation to go
They
go with,
both
but
work.
yeah. But yeah, it I think you need to be a creative of some sorts, an artist in your own area, at least, to sort of be able to put the puzzle pieces together and see, oh yeah, he might be a good fit, even though he hasn't done this thing specifically the way I imagine my game, would have in terms of music. Um,
Right.
so for non-musicians, it can be kind of hard to pitch, uh, what you would do for something, which is why I often, prefer to send over demos or some kind of snippets of what I would do so that they have something tangible. But for a lot of them, it's a pretty tall order to ask them to visualize something they can't visualize. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And they don't have the language to even describe what they want, even if they know what it is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're kind of stuck. You either need to collaborate or work with somebody who can see the vision, or you need to deliver that vision to them as clearly and as fast as possible, preferably.
It actually took me a very long time to sort of develop a set of skills and tools in how to coax out an accurate description of what a developer wants for a part, because they're not musicians. So when they try to describe what they want, they just do not have the language to tell you exactly what they want. So they end up using like really flowery language that oftentimes doesn't really make a lot of sense visually or auditorily. And I have made a bunch of mistakes early on in my career where I would just do a bunch of revisions and waste a lot of time just kind of poking around like, all right, well, let me try something else, see if you like it. And they're like, that kind of isn't it. And like, all right, well, let me make something else. And I would just waste a whole lot of effort and time. And I was pretty young and still figuring out how composing worked. And eventually, I kind of settled on asking them to send me examples, like several examples of types of music that they think fits the vibe or the sound that they're going for. And then it's up to me to sort of like take their multiple examples and figure out what the common thread running through them, whether it's a melodic compositional sort of cue, or whether it's a production style, or whether it's a tempo or something like that. And I sort of have to play interpreter for somebody who knows what they want, but they don't know how to say what they want. And that took me a while to sort of really come up with that rubric of how to talk to clients, and essentially save myself a bunch of time and effort when they give you kind of wishy-washy directions. And it still happens every once in a while where maybe something that they thought worked in their head doesn't actually work that way, or they change their mind later on. But it's worked pretty well for me so far to like just ask for several examples of things that you think fit that section, and then try to piece it all together from there.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's super solid because it goes from the abstract to the, tangible. Give me something concrete, what you would like to hear in this
Yep.
place. Sort of relating to that, for a long time I've been formulating this theory, or rather maybe I'd like to think of it as a series of observations perhaps, that most people seem to respond to the sound of music more than they respond to perhaps the actual the architecture of the music, the substance, in terms of the, if we took the effects of the melody and the harmony and the rhythm, I think it's actually everybody responds to those sort of fundamental qualities of music in terms of how the raw harmony and melody moves your soul. But I think there are a lot of people who struggle to enjoy that and get to that information if the surface level detail in terms of how the music sounds, what the sonic profile of it is, so to speak, if that isn't in place, a lot of people struggle to even appreciate the music underneath. Do you think that's something, have you made that observation yourself, and maybe how that relates to working with game developers as well? Like, do you feel like you need to nail kind of the rough mix every time,
Oh yeah.
so that they don't, if it sounds a bit raw, they get scared and think that this isn't working, and they back off?
Sometimes I have delivered a rough draft that was a little too polished. I put a ton of work and effort over the past 15 years, or maybe even more, um, in nailing my production and getting a workflow where I can make things sound 1000% professional. And I really do feel like that level of quality, like it makes the music transparent in that they're not listening to, oh, the snare drum kind of sounds like weak, and there, or some other flaw in the recording because it is a little rough. You as a composer, you know what it's going to sound like at the end, kind of like you have an idea like, oh, this part's going to sound massive. And but a lot of people who aren't professional recording engineers or musicians, they kind of hear something that's a little rough around the edges and they go, I don't know, it's just doesn't seem quite right to me. Something's missing. And so I oftentimes deliver roughs that sound like about 90% done. It does help that I can dial in some like really some really powerful sounding, synthesizers and drums and guitar stuff pretty quickly just because I have a ton of experience with it these days. So it's not too much work for me to come up with something polished fast. But I do think, when you're delivering something to a client, having something that really accentuates it. And I said transparent before, they can just listen to the harmony and the melody and the rhythm, and the production isn't getting in the way. Because I find that a rough sounding recording, the production gets in the way. Like people aren't listening to the composition of the album Saint Anger by Metallica because all they're doing is listening to how bad the snare drum is, and you can't listen past it. The production literally gets in the way of the composition. So I've spent so many years getting my production at a level so people can just listen to my compositions and listen to the notes that I'm writing in a satisfying way, so that it hits just exactly the way it's supposed to. And I do think that both composition and production are like almost equally important. Maybe like composition is definitely the most important, but like just underneath it, I think production is there. So I think that is a big deal.
Do you find that production has sort of become a part of the composition process itself, or do you still view them as being separate things? Because at least for me, like throughout the years, originally, like I was very much someone who responded to the harmony, the movement of the harmony and the melody and the rhythm. And then over the years, as I began to, dabble in writing my own stuff, you pretty quickly realize, wow, this sounds like shit. And then you begin to, you go through this depression period of wondering, like, well, I might be able to write something decent, maybe, but if it sounds like crap, nobody's gonna give it any, time of day. So,
Yes.
but yeah, I mean, as throughout the years, as I've worked on this craft, it's sort of the production. Like I think about it more through texture, like in terms of what is the texture that I'm imparting onto the harmony or the melody, and they have sort of for me become very intertwined. So is that something you relate to, or do you see it still as a separate thing?
Um, they are very much intertwined. I can think of like two examples. So one is I listen to a bunch of electronic music, and it is funny to me that like compositionally, there's like almost nothing going on in certain tracks. And the production is it's such a high and satisfying level that it still sounds like candy to your ears and you can still resonate it. Like it can be carried almost entirely by great production. You don't even have to do that much compositionally. Um, and then additionally, I do think that production is its own instrumentation. It's just as important as a classical composer or an orchestral composer, like knowing that the frequency ranges, or maybe not even the frequency ranges, but just the overall timbres that like, oh, the French horns live in this place. And when they do a forte, the French horn opens up and there's a lot more like treble presence to them. And like when they play softer, there is like that really low, almost sine wave type of sound to them. And when you're arranging for an orchestra, you sort of have to think in the same way as a producer who's arranging synthesizers and cymbals and drums and guitars and figuring out where they all live in the mix. And so I very much think that like production is just it's a different way of like mastering your instruments, and it's almost like arranging for an orchestra. Just recognizing what works here and what doesn't work here. What octave range should this be playing in? Should I be shaving off the high end? Is there way too much low end here? Is it covering up something else? Because I guess your composition almost doesn't matter if people can't hear it or hear it satisfyingly.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say that's a very fair assessment. But it's back in the day, well, I mean, it could be today as well, but certainly back in the day, the composers didn't have a producer. They didn't have a studio, so they had to, they had the composition, they had the players, maybe if they were lucky, and then they performed it through a sheet of paper, and maybe they had some time to work on it. But you really had to do all of the mixing and the production. You could say
Yeah.
orchestration and arrangement in the composition itself. And, throughout the years, we've sort of maybe diluted these different tasks to these different people. Not to say that that's a bad thing, not to shit on it, but certainly that's a perspective that is to an extent true.
Yeah. And I usually write directly into an audio workstation, to be recorded. I mean, a lot of times I'll write a melody or a chord progression on my guitar, but I've also played in bands, for most of my life, and there's a huge difference, writing directly into an audio workstation and arranging that way than there is that jamming with a couple people in a room and seeing what comes out. And sometimes that's really cool too. Different inputs give you different results. And I guess there isn't only one way to do it, but I very much view production as like arranging an orchestra when songwriting. And I will change what octave certain parts are playing in just to see if they fit into the mix better. And a lot of times, I guess the flexibility of like MIDI and modern recording techniques is just like such a boon for that. But it can also be an endless pit where you lose yourself and never finish anything. I've been guilty of that too, but
yeah, for sure. I guess we're going to loop back to the mixing stuff maybe later, but I do want to, so that I don't lose this question. You were talking about the delivery of the rough mix to the client, or whomever you might be working with. Do you always? So do you have a template that you have in place in terms of the mixing of it that you deploy? And if you do, I would love to sort of learn about it in as
sure.
much detail as you want to disclose. Obviously, some of this might be information that you want to keep to yourself. But yeah, do you have some kind of a template on your master bus or a kind of a setup in your DAW that is in place, or is it always from the ground up?
For the past probably about at least 10 to 12 years, I've been using Ozone's mastering suite, Isotopes Ozone, and I have a bunch of presets. I actually have folders of presets, but usually I use them as starting points. And one of the really nice things, at least in the more recent versions of Ozone, is you have the ability to load in reference tracks to check your mix against. So I'll load in a track that has the production value that I'm shooting for. And right away, when you A/B it back and forth, you can hear like, oh, their drums are way bigger than mine, or their high end has got way more sparkle on it, or their low end
Be
is.
the case very often.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
tends to be depressing discoveries.
Yeah. But I have spent, especially the last 10 years, just meticulously going back and forth between my favorite tracks, the things that I think leap out of speakers and sound so flattering, and figuring out how to get that sound. And now it's not that hard for me, now that I have enough practice to do so. Generally, when I load up a reference track, I make a small tweak here and there, but generally I'm about 90% of the way there when I just sort of load up a couple of instruments. And I mean, I have some drum sounds that I know sound amazing, and they're my go-to when I need to sound like that. I've got some guitar presets that I know exactly how to work with. And then I've got a bunch of synthesizers, like Serum sounds absurdly good in mixes. There's a couple of sample sets that I've worked with for a long time that I know like don't require a lot of massaging to sound awesome. And so generally when I go to that mastering and mixing stage, I don't have to do a ton of work to get things where they need to be. I can make a tweak here or there. I'll take it out to the car and listen with a big subwoofer really loud or something, and like, oh, we just need to, put a multi-band compressor or something on the low end there. But other than that, having some tools that you like really kind of have dialed in can make your workflow go way faster. And I guess I've been just building off of the decades of meticulous mixing experience, driving myself crazy, because I've had a million of those depressing moments, but they don't happen so often anymore, if ever at all. So I'm really happy with where my mixing and mastering skills are at right now, and I can kind of deliver something very polished in an afternoon if I need to.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it's not one single thing. It's all of your experience and all of the tools and approaches that you've accumulated throughout the years to sort of bring down to bear onto whatever you're working on. I was wondering, I would really love to know what kind of stuff you have in your reference track folder. I mean, that might be too, maybe too big of a question in terms of what tracks are there, but I would love to hear it, because your mixes sound really, really, really super solid. So that would be very useful.
So when I heard the Doom 2016 soundtrack in 2016 when it came out, the production was at a level of like just hugeness. I felt like the guitars leaped out of the speakers, like everything was so amazing and so satisfying. And there's a couple tracks from Doom 2016, and those are hard to sound like. That has actually been my challenge for the last like 5-6 years, is to figure out how to sound like that. But I've got something from, I think, the most recent Carpenter Brute release. I've got this band called Periphery. I listen to a lot of electronic and metal music, so generally that stuff is sort of pushing the envelope when it comes to production. There was an artist called Nitro Fun that does electronic music. They were on a game soundtrack that I did some work with, and I was like, this mix is massive, and I need to figure out how to sound like this. So that's in there. I've got a couple of things. Let me look really quickly. Just pull it up.
Take your time.
Yeah. What kind of background do you come from? Like, what kind of music did you grow up wanting to make?
Oh, well, growing up, I guess I really sort of slowly, gradually discovered my desire to write music. It wasn't sort of I was always creating stuff. Even at a pretty young age, we had this really crappy Roland like home keyboard thing, but it did have basically I believe 1 or 2 track recorder inside. Not like anything you could mess around with, but you could press record and then you could play on top of that. So I was playing with that even when I didn't have any conscious ambitions or ideas of wanting to make music. So I was sort of always doing it on the side whenever I bumped into a piece of tech that would allow me to record stuff. But I took some piano lessons when I was in basically kindergarten. Didn't really care about it that much. It was pretty hard for me. Then I think 2nd or 3rd grade, I started. Well, actually, before that, I joined a boy choir at
Oh, okay.
at the age of 6. and I was there for 9 years, which was pretty much like the biggest course in 4-part harmony that one can take in terms of like singing through all of the voices. Like you grow up as a kid and you always change from voice to voice, soprano, alto, tenor, bass.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And then you would sing all these same songs, but obviously different parts. So that was probably the kind of one of the threads that's gone through my life that has kept music there. Then I started playing drums probably during 2nd or 3rd grade. I got really into that. But yeah, I mean, not to make this too long of a story. I think 7th grade, some of my classmates were recording a kind of a demo EP thing as a coursework, basically, and they didn't have a singer, and they knew I sang, at least in the choir, so they asked me to join, and that's when we started writing our own music and tracks, and I loved it.
What style of music was it?
That
If
was
you had to
basically,
describe.
yeah, probably like pretty progressive rock.
Okay.
Maybe that was the time when bands like Incubus was pretty big. And what else? What else could sort of, something in that sort of a
Sure.
style. Yeah.
I actually
But
love their vocalist.
yeah, he's really good, really good.
Yes.
But I don't even remotely want to put myself or him in the same sentence. But the other guys were pretty
You could
inspired.
probably hit some higher notes. So I can tell you have a lower register in your.
Yeah, I can go really high actually as well.
Oh,
I have
really?
really high
I'm jealous.
falsetto. Well, it's a lot of it is what you have in terms of pipes, and yeah, I actually probably the falsetto was the first thing that I probably got decent at in terms of vocals, because I was just so shy in terms of singing. So I liked to quietly falsetto around. But
Are you familiar with a band called Leprous?
yes, I've heard. Are they in the same kind of?
They're like a progressive rock. They used to be more progressive metal, but now they're progressive rock.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. I
their
think
vocalist Einar Solberg, his falsetto is unlike any person, at least in the rock world. His vocal work, I think it's second to none. But I can see how some people, might not be into. I mean, a lot of people are very particular about the vocal timbres that they enjoy listening to. So I could see how some people are not, into his style of singing, but his falsetto is insane. So yeah, check them out at some point.
yeah, I think one of the bass players I worked with for a long time, I think he listened to them pretty heavily. He was really into like pretty much the more progressive, the more he liked it. Well, I definitely heard it. I just need to listen to it now again and connect the dots. But
Sure.
it's really, if a male vocalist nails the falsetto, it can be super powerful, because it can be a stark contrast to what people expect. So, and especially if they can also sing low, and let's say a song opens up pretty low at first and then goes into the high stuff,
Oh yeah.
that can be super impressive and interesting.
So I found a couple other tracks that I use in my mastering reference. Essentially, I try to find who's doing the best work in a certain genre and who's going to have the biggest budget for the best mastering engineer in the world. So, like, I'll take a couple of if I'm doing anything remotely orchestral, I might take a Hans Zimmer track from like Dark Phoenix or Interstellar or something like that, because I know that the credits list on that project is 1,000 people long, and they're going to have the best mastering engineer in the best room ever, making that sound as perfect as something can be. And I'll just use that as my baseline. Like, oh, well, that's what the best sounds like. So let's see how close we can get to that. And same thing with electronic music artists or with rock bands. There's a band called Dirty Loops. Some of their newer recordings are some of the cleanest and best sounding recordings I've ever heard. And I can tell that, you know, the credits list on these recordings is probably going to be 50 people deep in the best studios in the world, using the best microphones in the best rooms. So I use that as like my goal, as like the best in the world sounds like this. This is what you want to sound like, and it's kind of crazy what you can do in a bedroom if you're just anal enough about it, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. It's that's definitely like one of the best tips you can give people when it comes to mixes and you know, pursuing the balance of a sound, because like you said, these people pour millions into making this stuff, so it would do you well to kind of be humble in the face of that, and maybe say, you know, there's something here. Just out of interest, I've listened to, obviously, like, I have a lot of the Zimmer stuff in my reference folder as well, and you know, especially Inception,
Sure.
um, uh, Dark Knight. I know Hans has said that he has zero interest in how the music sounds like out of the theater, that he scores for the film theater or the film experience. Um, do you find that, because to me, when I'm comparing my stuff to his stuff, and to be fair, it's not a very good comparison most of the time because it's musically quite different and aiming for different things. So it's very kind of like the mixes to me sound um sort of maybe darker, perhaps it's more about the kind of the wall of sound and the energy hitting you, whereas I find that with my orchestra, I tend to get very, I want things to be very clear and hear where they're coming from, etc. Have you made any kind of, I guess I'm just interested in your observations in terms of what you've learned from his mixes, like from Inception or Dark Knight, or have you made sort of any kind of general observations or thoughts about that?
That's actually a really great question, and I feel like the biggest difference um, is going to be in dynamic range. And there's an awesome track off of the Dark Phoenix soundtrack. I listen to it all the time. It's called Gap. And I think that the melody and the orchestration and the instrumentation and the electronic music elements are just my favorite thing. And Dark Phoenix is an awful movie. I watched it on a plane a while back.
I haven't seen it. I don't.
But I think some of the orchestral cues in there are just probably my favorite thing I've heard Zimmer ever do, or the team of people who write for Hans Zimmer. That is a whole thing that I don't know how to make sense of, but I recognize that it exists and it can be problematic sometimes. Anyways, that aside, this track, it's so, the dynamic range on it is so much that even me blasting it at a loud level, the first minute and a half is almost inaudible because you require a noise floor, you know, that unless you're in a quiet theater, you will never get to get that kind of dynamic range. So I generally am not writing anything that has that kind of dynamic range to it, just because it doesn't work. In fact, when I'm doing mix references, I'm actually usually taking a tiny snippet of a song. I'm taking maybe the most intense section or the best section of the track, or the part of the track that embodies what I'm doing the best. And I just loop maybe 5 seconds of it. And I just go back and forth between that tiny snippet and then my track. Maybe I'm also looping the biggest section of it or something like that. And so that's going to be one of the biggest differences. And then also, you are right that, like, in fact, that's almost like a great criticism for like my method, is that he's writing for a delivery format that I am not writing for. Like he's writing for a theater sound system that is going to be wholly different than any listening experience that what I'm currently writing. If I'm writing for a video game, no one's listening to it in the theater. Nobody has that noise floor. Nobody has Atmos, in their home, and very few people have subwoofers. So that is a very interesting idea. So maybe I should take that out of my reference folder.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like you said, still this guy and his team at the top of their game. So
Yeah, with the
still,
best engineers in the best rooms in the world.
yeah, still very much worth keeping in the folder, I guess. But it's a lot of the time, like this is one of the things I'm trying to learn from all these references, learn from all these great pieces of music that I know sound great, but then I'm in the studio still pursuing, at least I think, something different. Yet I know the references have the impact, they have the balance that I'm looking for. So and a lot of the Zimmer stuff, like it strikes me more as it's more about the energy hitting me from the speakers. It's kind of a wall of a sound. It's sort of darker, puffier. Obviously, depends on the soundtrack in question, but yeah, Inception and Dark Knight, they don't quite have the uh, fidelity. Isn't the right word because they obviously have they are high fidelity uh, pieces of work, but detail and separation doesn't tend to be like, they strike me more as these sort of kind of very beautifully sculpted blob or wall of sound hitting me, and it can be hard for me to take the lessons that are there for me to take and learn and then incorporate into my mixes and the balance there. So I don't know if there's even a question in there somewhere, but
That's
but
fine.
but yeah, I mean, I guess it can be difficult to take the lessons that are there for you to learn, and especially like Hans's the mixes. I really struggle to, like, how can I take this stuff and put it into my music, because they really don't seem to like want to latch on to one another. And maybe that's like a technical lack of understanding from my part. But yeah, I mean, that's why I was asking about that, because maybe you you had a missing piece that I have failed to find.
What excites me about the modern Zimmer studio scores is he has a very modern sense of sound design, or his studio has it. I don't. It's hard to know who did what, but they're incorporating like very modern synthesizer sounds with entire orchestras, or they really think about the sound design as part of the orchestration. And you look at something like Inception, you have the Inception honk or the horn, or that is, it's just one note. So compositionally, it's all about production. It's all about arrangement and sound design. And it's funny, it's so iconic that when I have a bunch of sample libraries, there's an official industry term for the Inception horn. It's called the Brahm.
The Brahm,
Um,
yes.
yeah. And I mean, I use those sorts of things all the time. I try to incorporate them into pieces, but it's kind of funny that like some of his stuff compositionally is very, very like not dense at all, and other stuff is full orchestral. You look at something like Gladiator back in the day, even though that rips off a Holst, which I want to do too, so I don't blame them for doing that. But Gladiator is your full traditional orchestral sort of score, and then I really appreciate the modern elements, or like something like Dune. They spend a lot of time just coming up with sounds. Like you can evoke a feeling just by coming up with a really evil or grating sort of sound, and just let that wash over you, as opposed to coming up with like the best melody, some John Williams cue or something like that, which I also wish I could do. But I actually struggle more with recreating John Williams than I do somebody like Zimmer, because like I guess I understand the production a little bit more than, and I have compositional chops, but they're not at the level of a master like John Williams or something like that. So perhaps I gravitate to some of the more modern Zimmer stuff because like I feel like I know what's going on there and I can recreate it a little bit better. I can get more out of it.
Yeah, and that's precisely because when I was studying composition at university, it was very clear that almost every student there and almost every also teacher there, I don't know how harsh of a word I should use here, but they really didn't appreciate what Hans does, and they probably didn't even think of him as a composer. So basically a dude who tells a bunch of people to go and do stuff, and I don't agree with that take at all. And that this is precisely because I think what Hans does so brilliantly is the compositional stuff in the textural realm, like you said about Dune, that it's about finding certain sounds that on their own evoke so much in the listener, and I think that is composition as well. It's not chance what he bumps into, and yes, he brings in a bunch of players to do weird things, but it's him who has the vision and sees the connected dots, which is ultimately a lot of what composers do. They're visionaries. They see an end result that serves a some kind of a function or vision. So Hans is really a master at detecting and detecting those textures and writing in those textures. And I think Christopher Nolan said that Hans has basically, it's like minimalist music with maximalist production. And I think that is a brilliant way of putting it. It's very simple. There might not be many notes, but whatever is in there is highly tuned, like to 100%. This is precisely what it's meant to sound like. And I think if you scoff at that as a composer, then you're missing an entire world of composition.
I agree 100%. And part of the reason I enjoy the Dark Phoenix soundtrack is because I thought it actually did both of the amazing sound design that sounded like very unique and very modern and forward thinking, but it also had classic motif earworms that would get stuck in your head. And I thought that both the composition and the sound design and production were like both firing on that particular score. It's a shame the movie's terrible, but if you have some time, go and check out the Dark Phoenix score. I really adore it.
Maybe I'll skip the movie and just go to the soundtrack.
I wouldn't blame you even a little bit.
Okay, I'll do that. This kind of made me think of a soundtrack that I wondered if you, first of all, if you've heard it, you probably have, and what you think of it. Oblivion, the movie, not the video game, but the sci-fi movie. Tom Cruise.
I have not seen it, unfortunately.
Okay, have you heard the soundtrack?
No, who did it?
So that's M. Is it 83? Is that his? I never
sounds right.
I never remember these artists with the numbers and the names. M83, I think, and I think it was it?
I'm actually gonna make a note of it to check it out.
Yeah, I think you might really like it based on this, and I think that I think he collaborated with somebody else as well. Was it Trapanese? I'm not sure. I'll just maybe, yeah, M83, and I can't seem to find any collaborators. Okay, so Anthony Gonzalez, who is M83, then Joseph Trapanese. Yes, Joseph Trapanese. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think you might really like it. It's sort of like, again, like maximalist production.
I
Very, very simple
I'm into that.
composition, but powerful harmony movements, beautiful synths, and like this cinematic percussion orchestral stuff happening. Probably it's a shame that the movie sort of, I guess it was decently received, kind of very mixed opinions, but the soundtrack, I find it is just drop dead gorgeous, very soulful.
Cool.
Cool.
Is this what you expected we'd be talking about? Modern sound design when I
Uh,
would make
wh-
chiptune music?
uh, Maybe in part. I mean, because I like this is why I wanted to dig a bit into, because I know your chiptune stuff very well, but I also knew based on, because I watched and read some of your other interviews in preparation for this, and I saw that you speak of like in your TED talk you talked about doing orchestral music with a computer. So I definitely, as that's something as that I do, definitely wanted to um, learn more about your sort of relationship with that. And also, I'd love to hear it. By the way, is there anything that you can hear in terms of like orchestral stuff from you, or anything like cinematic in more towards
Sure,
that kind
sure.
of stuff?
I did a couple tracks for this game called Soundfall last year, and they're on an EP that I have on Bandcamp. It's called Massive, and
Oh yeah.
I went for a very hyper modern, kind of inspired a little bit by the Dark Phoenix soundtrack. The mechanic of the game is based around quarter notes and staying in rhythm. So they're pretty heavily downbeat focused songs. There are plenty of sections where I probably would have let something be a little bit spacier if I was, making the composition in a vacuum. But in order for it to fit well with the game design, there's definitely the downbeat just always keeps going on those tracks. Sometimes I even do it in weird time signatures. I think there's like 5/4 and 7/4 in there, but it has to be quarter notes because that's like the rhythm that the listener is supposed to sort of catch on to. But that EP, I used a lot of extremely modern synthesizer techniques. Uh, there's a bunch of orchestral stuff in there. There's some choir stuff actually. I've been doing tons of choir stuff lately. I found I have two libraries that I just think sound absurdly good. It's kind of an instrument that sounds so good. Like, why wouldn't I want to use it on everything? It just sounds too good. I think that's the Stredzov sampling, Storm Choir, and then I also have the
My boys at Strezov.
yeah, and I also have the Eric Whitaker Spitfire stuff, and he does some really good softer choir stuff. And they even have like stuff where you can detune voices and they get like out of phase and stuff like that, like really modern sorts of things. And it sounds extremely lifelike. And yeah, I find myself wanting to put it on every track. It's almost, I have to like stop myself a little bit.
Yeah, that's the curse of the new library. You get it, and then you're like, wait a minute, this can go pretty much everywhere, and then you just
I know,
begin
I
to
know, I know.
seep it into
Uh,
everything you do.
I do think that Storm Choir is like hands down the best sounding choir I've ever heard. Uh, it's astounding. It's not cheap though. Oof.
Yeah, I mean, Strezov is a bit pricey. I've done some like demo reviews of their stuff, and luckily they send that stuff over, so I don't have to drain my
I,
non-existent bank account.
I got to get on that train.
You got to start making some YouTube demos.
Yeah,
Um,
clearly.
yeah, I mean, if you were up to doing that, I could ask them if they were so inclined to send stuff over your way. But I mean, you're such a I consider you to be like such a high caliber artist in that sense that I would be surprised if they didn't want to do that. But have you tried Wotan and Freya by
I have not.
they are
Those are more like individual voices, right? Like Freya's a female
yeah, so that's
voice.
basically yeah, female choir, and then Wotan is like basically the male choir. I was gonna say that it's sort of lower end, but it does have tenors going pretty high up as well. Uh, I use those for most of the stuff I do. They are fantastically versatile. Like, still, they continually surprise me because they can get super powerful, but you can. What I love the most about them is that they can get super quiet and super detailed, and they still sound like very real and soulful. I just love like if you play with the female choir and you play something really quiet, it just like nourishes your soul. It's
Mm.
beautiful what they've done there. Um,
It's so satisfying when you have an instrument that like inspires you to create.
yeah, yeah, and you just pull it up and you start playing, and you're like, okay, there's a piece there, and you can just use them for uh, so many things. And I think I don't know about Freya, but Wotan, the male choir, was inspired by the stuff in the Lord of the Rings. So if you like,
Um,
especially the choir sections in the Moria scenes, in when they're in the mines. Uh, so that's they kind of took that texture and that style and put it there. It's it's incredible.
that's fantastic. I'll have to check that out. I am really happy with the Eric Whitacre stuff though. It's got a lot of interesting, even randomizing options to like kind of mess with intensity. And it doesn't do power well at all. I just go straight to Storm Choir for that, but it does softer stuff like really really beautifully. Like it's almost too dynamic. I find I have to like put a compressor like and slam it to make it fit into anything because it's just way too quiet. But it's nice to have that.
Yeah, I wish I could get my hands on some more of the Spitfire things because for me, I like the company. It seems to be for me like a very hit or miss depending on the library, and they are pricey, and they don't seem to want me to do any demo reviews of their stuff. So I can't check out everything. But what do you have a lot of stuff from them? What do you think about the company and
I
their
only have a
stuff
couple
overall?
things. I really love their free libraries. I can't remember what they're called. They have a bunch of free stuff that they've released.
Yeah,
And I haven't used it in a while, but I remember finding some stuff that sounded actually like really cool. Um, and there was one I was just using, their chamber strings, very expressive. Um, like I haven't tried every string library, but I really like them. There's chamber strings I use quite a bit. Um, Although I just had to move it to like an NVMe drive because it's so many gigs that like it doesn't read fast enough off of certain hard drives. You know, I get dropouts if I don't have it on the ultra fast hard drive because I just did like a switch to. I just like moved a bunch of stuff over and was like, oh, that's not going to work. So it
yeah,
is definitely it requires a very fast data stream and a lot of RAM, but I found they're very expressive. Um, and then I don't know what else I've used by Spitfire. I think there might be that and the free stuff, and then the Eric Whitacre choirs.
yeah. Is the free stuff? Is it the Labs lineup or
Labs, that's what it
yeah,
is. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. There are many good ones in there that people seem to praise. It's quite interesting because the one of the main guys, Christian Henson, I think he left the company or at least
Yeah, yeah. He
stepped
he
out of
said a bunch of dumb stuff on Twitter, I believe.
yeah, I believe there was some controversy or of some sort, but he has a new company now, I believe. I don't know, like I don't know what the situation is, if he's a part of it or just stepped out of the spotlight, but yeah, doing some new stuff there. But yeah, Spitfire libraries are really big because they have a ton of mic positions in them, and again, I can't speak to whether they are useful because I haven't played with many Spitfire libraries, but a lot of the mic positions, they obviously do increase the size of the library, so they become pretty massive, and a lot of people don't like that because they might find like 3/4 of the mic positions like not useful for them. So I wish there was a way to kind of select and then download. There probably is
Gotcha.
some kind of a manual way of doing it for sure, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, I love their, I love the, what's it called? Chamber Strings Evolutions by, what's his name? The composer, Olafur Arnalds, the
Oh,
Icelandic. Yeah, that's a really good sample library. Beautiful, beautiful strings, and it works because they've recorded these kind of waves of waves and textures of different stuff. So it doesn't need hyper sophisticated contact scripting and programming. So it's kind of simpler, and that hasn't been the strong suit of Spitfire in my experience. Like there are a lot of companies that do that stuff far more probably sophisticatedly, if that's even a word. But yeah, it works for that library because it doesn't require that kind of complexity. But that's a really cool one if you want like very emotional, soulful, textural stuff.
I do love that sort of stuff. So yeah, I'll check it out.
Yeah, that's a good one. Touching on so did you say the name of the game was Soundfall?
Soundfall, yes.
So what is the basic premise of the game? Is it some kind of a rhythm
It
game?
is a I think they call it a looter shooter. It's actually not a type of game that I play a ton of, or like a roguelike.
Yeah.
But the mechanics of the game, it's kind of music based in that every time you fire a shot at some of the enemies, it has to be like on beat with the song that's going on. It's usually based around quarter notes, and also all the animations of the enemies and stuff like that are kind of like in rhythm with the track that's going on. And they even told me like, oh yeah, the animations are like designed for 120 beats per minute. So if you don't try not to deviate too far outside of that, because all of a sudden the animations start looking like way too fast and stuff like that. But I ended up doing 2 new tracks for that because there's probably about a dozen artists, maybe even more than that, probably 30 artists that have tracks in that game because every track is a different level in the game. And I did 2 original tracks and then a third one. It's actually the final boss music of the game. And that was an interesting challenge only because the plot of the game is like this creature's trying to like destroy all of harmony in the world. And I felt like if you're writing the final boss music to a game about music, that it like has to rise to a certain level.
So
It's
that's
just
basically Melkor from Lord of the Rings, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so so I did 3 original tracks. One track, the final boss track, is called Discordance. That has a bunch of orchestral stuff. It definitely has the Eric Whitaker choirs on it and the Storm Choir, and a bunch of strings and things like that, mixed with synthesizers and big guitars. Pretty much everything that a final boss track needs. Loud choirs, big synthesizers, and big guitars.
Yeah, obviously. If it's you working on it, it needs to have some punchy guitars in there.
I find that that's like kind of transforming into my modern style is like big modern orchestral sound design mixed with heavy metal music and electronic music. That tends to be what I'm into these days, and I'm gravitating in that direction.
Yeah, cool. I need to listen to that EP better. I think I probably didn't do a full pass on it, but there was so much. You have so much great music that it's like I tried to listen to as much as I could for preparation for this, but going back to that kind of game design and the structure, you mentioned that you had to stick to that the rhythm aspect in to, at least to some capacity, be at those straight beats at least. Did you find that that was creatively nourishing? Like, did that create restriction for you that was a positive at the end of the day, or did you constantly find that you had to sort of fight the restriction somehow?
I find that I do a lot of my best work under restriction, whether it being a deadline or a heavy constraint, because it allows me to focus my ideas way better. I sometimes run into the choice paralysis of having too many sample libraries or too many instruments or too many different ways I can do something, and not knowing exactly where I want to take something can sometimes lead to me working kind of more slow. And it's funny to me when I have a hard deadline and easy, like very narrow constraints, I can just execute and know exactly what I need to do, or even just start throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you ever run into choice paralysis, but I have definitely made my own bed when it comes to that. I have too many things that sound cool, and you can go in any direction. So I actually very much enjoy constraint.
Yeah. And that's one of the modern problems we have, which is a very
it's a first world problem.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very what's the word that I'm looking for? Privileged issue to have. Like, we have so many, this digital environment, basically endless recording, endless tweaking, endless adjustment. We have all these fantastic instruments and plugins out there. So it's really become our job to create the restrictions that we need to actually get stuff done, and also not to get overwhelmed, because I'm definitely a bit of a perfectionist. I tend to obsess about details, etc. So I need to fight that somehow, and bring the sort of balance into the process, and not endlessly obsess about details that might matter down the road, but probably right now they're bigger fish to fry. So I don't know if you could sort of maybe touch on that in terms of obviously in terms of this project, that game design element created that restriction for you, but have you found that there are any overarching mindsets or tools or anything that allows you to focus your thoughts and your attentions and your efforts?
So compositionally, obviously you want to get down strong melodic ideas, but sometimes I struggle in knowing exactly where I want to take a piece next, because I wish I could just think and have this grand idea of how a track is going to sound or look or be, and then all I have to do is will it into existence. But a lot of times my tracks involve a lot of experimentation and messing around, or trying to figure out where to take a track next, whether it's a chord change that maybe isn't coming to me, or maybe a way to highlight the melody or the rhythm or something like that. And so sometimes I get stuck and I need to take a day off or whatever, but maybe I do have a deadline, so I will use that time where I'm feeling a little stuck on my composition, and I just put all of that into production and arrangement. And so I will go and use that time to okay, well, I can't think of what I want to do next. Maybe I can think of that tomorrow. But for the rest of the day, I will work on getting this guitar tone to sound exactly the way I want it to sound, like the stuff I already have recorded. Or I'm going to get this drum sound that sound exactly the way it should be. Or I'm going to take the expression on this MIDI violin that I worked on, and I'm actually going to tweak all of the envelopes to sound exactly, how they should sound in a satisfying way. And I'll just work on the polish when I'm feeling that I am stuck creatively. And I kind of go back and forth. It's like a different way to sort of like, I can do the more mechanical sorts of things when I'm not feeling so creative, and vice versa.
Yeah. I think the kind of a diverting attention technique is pretty good because it allows you to still keep making progress and focus on the work and not get, what's the word? Yeah, you don't get stuck in the, I suck, I'm a horrible composer, I can't come up with anything. You still
Yeah, and it
use the
happens.
yeah, you use the time effectively, and you put it somewhere else. You don't get, bummed down by the fact that you got stuck with the composition. So
Yeah, sometimes like everything you try just sounds awful or generic, or it just uninspired. Like it's just not serving the piece, and I'll work on it, and then maybe overnight, I'll be listening to a bunch of music or whatever, and I'll hear a musical device like, oh, they start with like the bass there. Oh, maybe I can like use that as like a way to come up with new arrangement ideas or compositional ideas. Like, oh, that's how I need to start the next part. Um, not necessarily ripping off music or whatever, but we're all borrowing compositional techniques that we hear, around us and stuff like that. And so it helps to sometimes just step away and get inspired by something else. And uh, that's how I tend to do it, because sometimes I need to step away from a piece for a day or two before I can really take it in the direction it needs to go. And
yeah,
then sometimes it all just comes in a single day, and I wish that could be every day, but that's not usually the case.
yeah, yeah. There's all kinds of days, like super
Yeah.
highs, and like yeah. I mean, you go to the studio, everything like a song comes to life just like that, and you're like, this is the best thing ever, and you're just like so taken by the music and feels good. And then the next day you go back in and you just everything sucks and you
Yeah.
you
Sometimes.
yeah, you can't come up with anything. Um, are your sort of in terms of your typical work day, like what kind of hours do you put into, well, let's say, in terms of a week and also in terms of a single work day? Do you have like a more set schedule, like a rigid approach to that, or what is what are your working hours like, and what is like a typical work day slash work week?
So perhaps this is part of a larger conversation. But currently, um, I actually have no work right now. I don't have any active jobs. Um, and to be honest, I have spent the last 6 or 7 months mostly managing my parents' estate, because my dad passed away in March. And before that, I had been doing caretaker work for him, because my mom passed away a few years before that, and she was taking care of him. So uh, I've had a few smaller jobs in the last year, but I've mostly been sort of managing the stuff at home, selling off certain things that need to be happening, and figuring out all the legal stuff, which is, at least in America, fairly complicated, and has been taking a long time. And so I've been using most of the new time that I have now, in between jobs, to work on a new record, solo record that I'm doing, and also record for a band that I play in, as well. And so I'm working on both of those records at the same time, as well as I've been doing live fill-in work for bands. There's a band called Bit Brigade that I did a tour with in May. They do live speed runs of video games and play the soundtrack along to the live speed run. It was very challenging, but it was a fun month. And I actually had to spend the whole month like preparing for the material, because it was quite difficult. But So I've been doing a lot of live shows and traveling, and I've been managing a lot of stuff at home, but my day to day, every day is very different. And I spend as much time as I can. I've been trying to be a little bit more rigid with uh, my schedule. I have a track that's due at the end of the month that I'm doing for a friend. It hasn't been announced yet, so I don't know what I can talk about it. But he's another game composer who asked me to do a remix for an album that he's putting out. So I'm working on that right now. I have another band that asked me to join them for a tour coming up later this year. I'm deciding whether I want to do that or not, or whether that makes sense to put the time into that. And then I'm rehearsing for a MagFest, which is the music and gaming festival. It's later this month. I think it's about a week and a half. And so I usually spend 2 to 3 hours going over that set each day, trying to get that material awesome. The whole concert is live streamed, so I don't know if you've performed live before, but since it's live streamed, recorded, and put on YouTube, you're getting the direct guitar recording, which can be very unflattering if you're a little sloppy. And in a loud live venue with a bunch of room reverb, you can get away with a little bit of unevenness in your playing. But when it's a direct recording straight to the board that's going to be put on YouTube forever, I'd prefer that to sound a little bit cleaner than, some of the other material. So I've been spending a lot of time rehearsing for that. So essentially I play in a bunch of bands, as well as performing my own work at various video game conventions and shows across the United States. I've played around the world, but the United States lately. And I've been in between preparing that stuff, managing the estate at home, and then also working on my own recordings and stuff like that. But in terms of projects, I've been out of work for quite a bit, and that's actually not that uncommon. I have a really good friend. He's an animator, been in the industry for probably 10 or 15 years. He said he was out of work for 7 months earlier this year. There's an animator and art designer who works for Minecraft that I know that their contract is ending at Minecraft, and they have been looking for work for the last 6 or 7 months and haven't been able to find anything. And it's actually probably due to a lot of things. One, luck, but two, the game industry, essentially a lot of the venture capitalists who had been funding a lot of game projects, that money has largely dried up. And so some of the game companies I've worked with in the past, like, they would get $3 million from Apple to develop their game or a port of their game to, I don't know, some new Apple console or Apple game streaming platform that they're working on. And so it was all that kind of money was flowing, whether it was Google Stadia or, whatever. And now that money is not flowing nearly as much. And so the game companies have been like having a very large crunch lately and laying off tons of people, even in year of record profits, just because that venture capital money isn't there. And so I have been very light on work, and I've been using it to focus on my own releases and my own stuff, and also just manage things at home, which has been a very arduous process.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your father.
Thank you.
But yeah, but it sounds like you are making the most of the situation. I mean, still like staying very active and I mean, really happy to hear that you're writing a new solo album as well. So can't wait to hear how that develops. But was that like when I don't know if there was like a moment when you noticed that things were sort of getting quieter. Did you have a conscious moment where you decided what your attitude or approach or mindset is going to be towards this period? Because it still seems like you're playing a lot, you're still being active, you're working on stuff instead of sort of curling up into a ball into a corner of a room, but like you're still playing and being active? Is that like a conscious thing you decided once you realized that things were shifting?
So it's kind of a complicated question. Let's see if I can or a complicated answer. Let's see if I can work the narrative into a way that makes cohesive sense. Uh, can I back up a little bit?
Sure, you can go
Because
wherever you want to go.
you kind of wanted to talk about, my journey as a composer a little bit, right? Well, in 2018, I was getting a lot of gigs, to the point where the jobs I was working at the time, I was working part-time, and I actually had to quit that job because I couldn't split my time between um, between composing and and that job. It was too much pressure, and not enough time to do so. And so I quit my job in 2018 to do music full time. And I had a bunch of good gigs going. I was doing work for E3, and I was doing a bunch of game soundtracks. I was doing commercials, and later in 2018, my mom passed away, and I had to move in with my dad to take care of him as a caretaker. And I continued to work on games and game soundtracks and stuff like that, but I missed a few deadlines because it was balancing those things. Were actually I didn't really miss that many deadlines. I'm really good with deadlines. It's when sometimes developers would not give me a deadline, and that was problematic because there was always so much going on at home, and I was trying to transition. And so if you never gave me a deadline, I wasn't working very efficiently on stuff. So there was a couple of projects that kind of fell through the cracks. I got an offer to do, they wanted me to do a demo track for a really big game franchise. And that ended up, it was like a legacy franchise. It would have been a really big remake for it. And they were like, hey, can you do a demo for this just so we know that we want something so that we can pitch you to the board of directors or whatever. And I just didn't do it because life at home was too hard at the time. And, that slipped by and I wasn't able to do it. And I have been doing work, essentially composing part-time and taking care of my dad since 2018 to 2023. And work has actually been pretty good for the most part. It's been a little scattershot, but for the most part, it had been pretty good. And then in 2023, Dad died. And actually, let me back up. So in 2022, I did a show in Baltimore, and I got offered $100,000 a year to be a resident composer for a big game company. But I had to move to Baltimore to do it, and I couldn't take it because I was taking care of my dad. So there's another huge opportunity that I had to just I can't do it. And then in 2023, he passed away, and I've just been managing things ever since. But it's unfortunately, it's been difficult for me to put the level of focus and dedication into my career, right? Especially when things had been taking off. And so now I have, I guess, the time and the availability and the drive, but the jobs aren't quite there. So I will say to anyone who is into, trying to get into composing industry, luck plays a huge, huge part of it. I know tons of people who are amazing, amazing composers, and they're all struggling for work. And I find myself struggling these days, and some days I feel like it's feast or famine. I'll get 10 jobs that show up in the same week, and then I won't hear anything from anybody for 6 months or something like that. And so luck plays a huge part of it. I try very hard to sort of make my own luck, to make my recordings so good that how could people not want to hire me? I try to be undeniable. And actually, a lot of gigs I get almost the majority of gigs I get from shows performing. And when I'm performing a show, like I composed this track for this video game. I tell them, during the show, I wrote the soundtrack for this wrestling game. And a lot of the people who come to my shows or a lot of the events I'm playing have game developers at them. And so they'll come up to me afterwards and be like, "Hey, I want to, I want you for this project." In fact, I played at a after party at Game Developer Conference in 2014, I think it was. And at that show, a developer came up to me, a bunch of people came up to me, but said, "Hey, I want to make this game based around your music." And they ended up making a flash demo, actually, and it won some game jam competition, and they decided to flesh it out into a full game. And 4 years later, it ended up releasing as a game called Just Shapes and Beats, and there's a bunch of other artists on there, but that game has probably sold 1 million copies or more worldwide, and it's been one of the hugest things for my career. But the game only got made because some game developers saw me at a show and got inspired to make something. So I get a lot of gigs from concerts that I play, and I try to advertise myself that way. And it's been really good, but unfortunately, the payoff. Sometimes, like a developer will be like, "Oh, I want to work with you in the future," but I won't be actually making that game for another 4 years or so. In fact, Soundfall, they saw me play at an anime convention in 2015 in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then they contacted me for years about this project, and it, ended up being a huge project, but it took 4 or 5 years to come down the pipe. So I don't know what game developer is going to hit me up who saw me 5 years ago or 1 year ago or something like that. And that's why I say that luck has such a huge thing about it, because connections are everything. Making that connection with a developer, and they might not be looking for projects, they might be working on another project and they may want you for the next project that happens 6 years later. So that luck plays such a huge role in it. And unfortunately, I have not been very lucky lately. So I'm using that time to invest in myself. And make some more music that will hopefully inspire more people. A lot of my stuff has been licensed for games, especially the chiptune stuff. Lots of indie game developers who are fans of my work would be like, "Hey, can I just license this track for my game?" But sometimes it's been awesome, and most of the games are nobody's ever heard of, but some of them have been fairly large titles.
Yeah. No, it's you've definitely, sown a lot of seeds across the years, and it's I've only been involved in the video game industry for how long have we been making this game now? Maybe 2-3 years or something like that. But it's definitely now that I'm following the scene a lot more, and I actually have some contacts in the field, it's definitely a lot of people have been saying what you've said about the drying up of certain funds, moving around, and and then there are some companies that are doing great, but it seems like at least the way the money used to flow before isn't happening right now, and I think it will take some calibration for the industry to sort of readjust and find its footing, and also perhaps understand where they should be putting their money, because
Absolutely.
music is a huge part of a game. Depends on the game, obviously, but
Right.
for some games more important than for others. But yeah, I'm hoping the situation sort of balances out, and yeah, there's been a lot of layoffs in all kinds of departments, and obviously then we have this technological change happening simultaneously with a lot of the AI tools, etc. So that's gonna.
Right.
I don't know if you
Uh,
have
um,
any thoughts on that, but
um,
that's a very general question. But you can
no,
go
no.
anywhere
So,
you want.
my girlfriend is an artist. She He's a paleontological artist for scientific work, and
Wow.
fantastic or whatever. But artists, visual artists, have really been feeling it. In music, it hasn't quite hit yet, but there are one or two things that have come out that definitely put a little fear in me that like, oh, my job might be next, kind of a thing. It's it was, I can't remember what it was called, but it allows people to take someone's voice and make new vocals using someone else's voice. So I heard like a Metallica track sung by the singer of Megadeth, or maybe it was the other way around. I think it was, but it sounded awesome. And it was kind of like scary, where you're like, uh-oh. And my first thought was someone's going to get sued real quick. Like there's going to just be lawsuits because you own your likeness.
Mhm.
And I feel like the art world, unfortunately, it's been a little bit, it's a little bit grayer in terms of like copyright and likeness, where like your drawing is your likeness, and as opposed to something a little bit more visually available, like someone's voice or visually, but like you see somebody singing, that's part of their likeness. And I guess it's music might be safe. And I'll tell you why. And I might be way wrong about this. So AI art, in terms of visual art, mostly works by stealing. It steals very cleverly, like in the way that like BitTorrent transfers files very cleverly by turning it into tiny little pieces that are untraceable, and then it repackages them on the other end. But maybe that's a bad analogy, but uh, AI visual art mostly works by stealing and sampling. And sampling, as you probably know in music, is A, really illegal, but B, there are content ID filters everywhere that if they actually sample something enough where you could tell, you're going to get copyright struck like immediately. Um, and so it could be that the content ID systems may prevent some of the learning algorithms from being effective enough because they can't steal enough. If that makes any sense. That's my theory on it. I have listened to some AI generated music, and I find them to be directionless and without intent. And so, because there is no intent, they um, they just aren't captivating in any way. Because like music is over a function of time. Meanwhile, visual art is static. And so you can make a frame that looks compelling, but making a million frames that sound compelling in sequence, because for music is a journey over time. And so you have to have intent of where you want to take that. You want the listener to, feel a gravitas as the music builds up to something. And since there's no intent, then it just becomes uncompelling noise that resembles someone like attempting music, but it doesn't actually sound that good. I hope I'm right, because I'm probably going to be really wrong about that. They're probably going to figure that out at some point. But currently, the AI music that I've heard has been extremely uncompelling. So I feel a little safe. But I am worried about it. And I also have so many visual art friends whose jobs have either already been affected, or there has been talks in the industries they work in or the companies they work in about possibly implementing some of these as a cost saving measure. And I have solidarity with them for essentially being against the use of it. There are some great use cases for AI and large learning models. There's one called AlphaFold, which uses those sorts of models to determine the shapes of new proteins in scientific fields, and that'll be amazing for medicine. And my background's actually in molecular biology, so it's like a super amazing thing. But to take work away from creatives, that's the one thing that we should not be using that for. We should be using it to automate stuff that people don't want to do, not things that people dream their entire lives to do. That's my take on it. But there's always a race to the bottom, to make the most money or to save the most time. So people are going to use the technology if it exists. But
it's actually, that's a very deep rabbit hole, but like the whole conversation about intent behind music, because I'm of the belief that music models meaning. That's what it does to me. And I think we'll probably, I think if you, let's say the AI music thing continues on, as it probably will, I think a lot of musicians might be able to employ themselves by becoming essentially like prompting engineers or curators of the AI content. Because like you said, there isn't, at least now, nothing behind the AI is deploying intent behind it or sort of injecting it into it. But with AI, let's say, obviously it can generate a lot of content very, very fast, which it kind of can go around the quality aspect through the quantity. And let's say at the other end of that quantity, there is someone like yourself, for example, who would be going through that content and curating like the best bits out of it, which you could then forward for a company for whatever reason, etc. Or you could be the person, because with visual art, some people call themselves, prompting engineers. That's the term that they've coined for themselves. So basically, there is a level of skill and understanding behind, what to tell the machine to do. So you can't always simply blindly write something random down, but actually understand how it responds to these different prompts. And a lot of people have taken that very far. So something similar might happen with music as well, but it will be an interesting thing for sure, because I think there are a lot of deep philosophical questions about whether machines can at some point begin to, inject that intent into the, I think it will answer a lot of interesting questions about life and souls and consciousness, etc. Because, yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I don't want to go deeper into that because I probably don't have the language to even articulate all of those thoughts, and I haven't thought it through very, very much. But it's definitely interesting to see what is going to transpire.
for sure, it's a rabbit hole. I try to stay on top of any new technology stuff that's going on, and also there's the human aspect of how it affects the people that I work with, I love and respect. And so I think that I'm always going to be on the side of people rather in artists rather than corporate profits. And that's an easy choice for me to sort of say, like, I'm for this or against this. But I will wholly admit that there are plenty of positive applications of these sorts of models. And but taking away from creatives, I'm not a huge fan of. But we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I agree on those points, and it's very interesting to see where it's gonna take us. But I think we're gonna leave it at that, because it's just, like I said, I'll probably be rambling more than I usually do on that that topic. But I think if we I mean, I usually sort of start these by going through someone's background. Obviously, we've been going for quite a while now, so this
Yeah,
is
it's all
this
good.
is being this is being kind of atypical. But I actually prefer this much more if it's possible to structure things sort of more uh, impulsively. No, I don't know.
I could do some more origin stuff if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, because I know you're now based in Buffalo, New York.
Yes,
Is that where were you born?
I'm in the house I grew up in right now because I had to move back
Okay,
in with my dad
right.
and
Yeah,
to take care of him. So I have I have lived in Buffalo my entire life. Not at home, but I'm now back in the bedroom that I started when I was recording directly my guitar directly into my line in my computer when I was 16 years old.
yeah. Has that brought up any, like, obviously brought up some emotions, but
Oh my
has it
God.
felt, yeah, did it sort of was it like a positive kind of a circle loop closing, or what kind of emotions were or thoughts were running through your head when you came back to that same place?
Um, to be honest, I was so concerned about my dad managing his health. I didn't have time to think of it. And now there's so many reminders in this house that I find myself frequently just like getting stuck in a morose, like sad nostalgia. I don't know if nostalgia is the right word. I don't know if I can come up with exactly the right words, but all of a sudden I'll see like a picture on the wall from like when I was, 8 years old, or I'll see, a photo of me and my parents or my sister or something, and it would just be like processing the whole last 4 years in a moment, and it'll stop me in my tracks. And finding ways to work through that has been it's been tough, but I've got like a really amazing support system in Buffalo. My girlfriend has been incredible throughout everything, and I, at least my dad was financially fairly secure, so I haven't worried about money so much. But unfortunately, I've had to like sort of put my career on the back burner, and now I have to restart it. Like all these things that I we're trying to build, and I kind of had to only half work on them for a while. Now I have to get them rekindled uh, and roaring again. And it's been tough, but I've spent this time sort of mastering my tools. I've been going and learning sound design synthesis, and I've been learning orchestral arranging better, and I have been studying my mixing. I'm constantly a student. Like anything I listen to, I'm always taking notes. Um, Whether or not I, commit that to my full-time memory is a different story, but I'm always doing active listening. I'm paying attention to the arpeggios on a dishwasher when it's done, the beeping sounds, and saying like, oh, that's a cool way to do a sound effect. Like that's a 1/5/1/9, something like that. That's a cool way to get that vibe that, oh, you're done now. So I can't turn my brain off. And so I've been using this time to sort of meditatively get better at my craft so that I, the jobs I do get, I'm 100% ready for, qualified. And I probably veered off the original intent of the question, but that's how conversations go.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But yeah, actually, one of the things I wanted to touch on earlier relating to that is I think you'll be fine because I mean you have such immense skill in what you do, and also in terms of based on what you described, you've invested in the relationships before. You've sown those seeds, and like you said, oftentimes it is a matter of timing and just luck. But like you said, you like to make as much of your own luck as possible, and really it's about being ready for the opportunities when they come to you, being um people like to say being in the right place in the right time, but it's more than that, because you also need to be able to take on the challenge and actually execute. And like I said, it seems like you've taken this time, although it's been a rough period for the reasons that you mentioned. You've still made the most out of that difficult situation, which is largely what I try and convey through this podcast, because like a lot of people will find themselves in similar situations, and that's why I want to share as many perspectives and tools and things that people can use to move past those hard points. But it seems like you keep investing in your skills. You've done the right things in the past, and there's stuff you need to take care of right now, and that's what you're doing. And there will be a point when that kind of levels out, and then you'll be ready for other stuff. So I think you'll be perfectly fine.
I think so too, but it's still hard sometimes. It depends on the day. And
yeah.
you've talked a bit about sort of being depressed about music, because it can be very depressing sometimes. Or you're talking about like hearing a mix or hearing an arrangement, and you're like, it's just not where I want it to be, or something. And we can only be great if we are our own worst critics sometimes. If we're not critical enough with ourselves, we'll never, rise to a level of greatness, because we're not putting in the amount of scrutiny and detail that like making something incredible often requires. But there's a cost where sometimes you're a little too hard on yourself.
Yeah. That's like I think perfectionism. I have this concept of relative perfection and absolute perfection. And absolute perfection would be what you can do with infinite time, infinite resources, infinite skills, perspective, wisdom, etc. But obviously the reality is that we never have that. The people who can get closest to that, are people like Zimmer, who probably understands this, and that's why he hires the best of the best, so he can outsource as much of that as possible, and then he can focus on the things that Hans Zimmer can do the best. But with relative perfection, you understand, time limits, resource limits, focus limits, and skill limits, all these things, and you got to say, okay, this is the deadline I have. I'm going to do my best, but I can only deploy my best within that time frame and within those resources that I have. And it's but it's really important to be a perfectionist fundamentally, not in terms of the practical side. Like, yes, you want to be as perfect as possible, but within the realism context of it, like
absolutely.
But without the vision for perfection, I don't believe we have art, because the art speaks to people because it touches on something undeniable and fundamental. And also in the execution of the art, may be a piece of music or a painting or whatever, it needs to be really good so that it can convey what it's trying to convey. So that's why I also don't subscribe to the idea of, oh, you shouldn't try and be a perfectionist or be so detail oriented, because we need those things to make our art as good as possible. So it's a really tricky balance to discover, because at some point, your perfect vision needs to die a bit, because you have to release this thing at some point. But yeah, I mean, that's the perfection theory that I've been brewing for some time.
You made a statement earlier that reminded me of, like, I guess how I got started in the game industry. And you were talking about like preparing and giving yourself the tools to execute when the opportunity arises. And I got my start in the game industry in probably like 2009, 2010. But that's only because in 2003, I was very much in the online community of people who were covering old video game music, mostly NES music. And we were taking old NES tracks and playing them on guitar. My mindset at the time was that the NES sounded terrible, but I really liked the compositions and the tunes, so I wanted to hear, the Mega Man track with loud guitars and drums and stuff like that, as opposed to noise channel drums or something like that. And so I spent 6 or 7 years making covers. There's a really vibrant communities online that I participated in, competitions, some of which are still going to this day. And they were ways for me to beef up my production skills. We would critique each other and like, oh, your drums sound like, crap. And I'm like, oh, well, give me some feedback. I want to figure out how to make them sound good. And in fact, next month when I submit to this competition, like nobody's going to talk about my drums because I spent all this work all month. They're going to talk about how good they sound.
Was this the overclocked thing?
No, actually, it was something called Dwelling of Duels, but it's a lot of people participate in both overclock remix and that sort of competition. There's a lot of crossover there. And in order to learn how to play all these video game songs, I was deconstructing every channel, and I would go through all of the old NES files or the Game Boy sound files or the Nintendo sound formats and look at the individual channels and the recordings and break them down so I could play them. All of a sudden I learned a ton about video game composition. And it was a couple things. It was paying attention to like, oh, well, during the underwater tracks, they kind of like use this. For some reason, all the underwater tracks are in 6/8 for some reason. I don't know why they are. They're not really, but or I would notice some of the ways that they would generate intensity during boss tracks or something like that. And I also learned how they created all the sound effects. Like, oh, on a menu, they do this arpeggio that's a fourth, a chordal tone rising arpeggio, and that makes sense because you're having like you don't need to have like it's very ambiguous feeling. Meanwhile, like when you get a 1-up, oh, that's a whole major arpeggio. Well, of course it is, because a major arpeggio makes you feel good, like you did a thing. And so I started to think about, the theoretical reasons of like why certain sound effects work, why, there's a major chord playing when my dishes are done in the dishwasher, stuff that you would normally not think about.
Does your dishwasher actually give you harmony or like an interval thing?
It's usually a monophonic pulse wave doing an arpeggio, and it's like do 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 do, and you can look at that as a chord.
That must be. That kind of reminds me of Japan a bit. I've been in a couple of places in the US, but that's something I don't think you would ever hear in a European
interesting. It is also very common in Japan.
Yes. But is that like a US thing, like a common?
I find that it's just it's a way of taking the emotions that are based in composition, like minor chord sounds sad and major chord sounds happy, and baking that into interfaces and design. So my car has like a warning system when you get too close to another vehicle or you're veering out of the lane, and it'll go pop, pop, pop. But that noise is actually like a secondal harmony where it's really dissonant sounding. And it's catches your attention and also indicates something wrong is happening right now. And you can use those sorts of things. And I learned a lot of that from old video games. When something bad would happen, something very dissonant would play on the pulse channels. And it might be something that happens in a quarter of a second, just a super fast melodic flourish, because that's how they made a lot of sound effects back then. But you could really put intent into the design of that sort of thing. So I found myself studying video game music for at least 6 or 7 years before anyone ever asked me to do a video game soundtrack, which is largely because that's right when mobile games and indie games were starting to take off. Because before that, when I was doing covers, there was no video game composition jobs, unless you lived in Japan or you lived in Europe with some of the European studios, like Codemasters or something like that out of Britain, or Rare maybe. Yeah, those jobs didn't exist. It wasn't until indie gaming and mobile gaming, all of a sudden the scope of what a game could be really came down. And the people who were making those games were people who were listening to my video game remixes or listening to the chiptune music. Because at some point, I heard someone make live chiptune music at something called Penny Arcade Expo. And I was like, oh, I've been studying NES like sound design for the last 6 or 7 years. I know how they're doing that. Like, I didn't realize that people were making new chiptune music until I saw someone perform it at a concert. And I was like, oh, cool. I've been studying for that for the last 6 years and didn't even know that I was, because I'd been breaking apart different old video game songs. And then when somebody hired me to do a game soundtrack, it's like, oh, I've been studying this. Didn't even know that I was getting ready for this job. And it came up, and it turns out that like doing all these competitions and focusing on my production value like actually mattered, because I have to do all my own recording for these projects, and I don't have a mixing engineer or a mastering engineer that are on budget. They're just hiring me, to do everything myself. So I became very self-sufficient and didn't realize I was studying for that. I was just a fan who had been doing stuff for years. And it turns out a ton of people who came from that scene are the people making huge waves in the game industry the last 5 or 6 years, or maybe longer than that.
Yeah. I think that's a great example of how you always have to, you always should be doing something, because you're always building on top of where you just came from. And you can't expect like an opportunity to find you and then sort of explain to someone why they should give you this or that. You have to have something to show them right now. And
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not developing skills right now, then you're just not developing skills at all. Like, you can't wait around for the opportunity to come and then accrue these skills and perspectives and then do it. It's already going to pass you by.
Exactly. You have to have the skill set in advance, which is tough. It's probably very intimidating. I guess I've been lucky enough to sort of like grow alongside of the tools that have become available. I mean, the home recording technology changed so much during the 2000s. I don't know how old you are. I'm 40. But
34, I think. I always struggle to remember this. I think I'm 34 now.
But when you look at something like the sample libraries that we were talking about, how rich they are, and the amount of articulations and how natural they sound. Well, nobody could run a 50 gig library in 2005. In fact, they didn't even really exist. Drum samples, good sounding drum samples started to come out right around 2004, 2005. I think it was, there was one called BFD, and there was another one called the Drum Kit from Hell by Superior Drummer. I think that's what they ended up calling it eventually, instead of Drum Kit from Hell. I could be wrong about that, but that's how I remember it in my head. And it was all of a sudden, oh, wow, you can get like studio quality like drums that aren't electronic music. They're actually like acoustic instruments. And drums work because they're short samples, right? Doing a longer sample like a articulated violin is very different. But I remember the first time I heard a friend of mine do an orchestral thing. I think it was Vert, actually, Jake Kaufman, who did Shovel Knight and a ton of other soundtracks. He was in the same hobbyist scene making video game remixes as me. And I think he did a Metal Gear Solid remix that had a full orchestra. And I was like, wait, how do you do that? And he's like, oh, there's this thing called East West Quantum Leap Symphonic Orchestra. And like back when we were kids, I pay for all my stuff now, but people pirated that stuff back in the day. There was the same copy of of East West Quantum Leap Symphonic Orchestra, going around all the people that I was friends with in that scene, because it probably took, I don't know, 3 days to find a file share thing to find it. And I don't recommend doing that these days. You should pay for all of your software. But when you're starting out and you're not making any money on stuff, we learned on pirated tools and then got the experience that we needed so that when we actually moved to the professional sphere, it's like, oh, I actually have practice with that. Because a lot of those tools, like, I mean, MIDI sample sets are like very cumbersome to work with if you don't know what you're doing. And you can spend a whole lot of money for things that don't sound very good if you don't know what you're looking for.
Yep. Yeah, the scope is pretty vast. And
Yeah.
also it's kind of tricky because a lot of these things, most of them you can't demo. There's no way to demo them unless you can go to a friend's place and try it out.
Exactly. I mostly buy stuff on Black Friday, and then but I go off a lot of friends' recommendations and stuff like that, and I do a lot of YouTube demos. But for me, the interface almost matters just as much as the samples, because if the interface is a pain to work with and I can't get like a good sound out of it, like intuitively, it's just more work than it's worth to me. So, and that's one of the issues, and they're so expensive. Well, they're prohibitively expensive that I'm not saying anyone should pirate anything ever, but when you're learning, it was helpful for me back in the early 2000s.
Yeah. No, it's I agree. If a library has a horrible user interface, it needs to sound super exceptional for me to bother using it, because it affects your workflow so much.
It does.
And if it's a pain to use, then you're probably not going to get inspired by it. And yeah, the workflow is tedious and cumbersome. So, and I like to work with tools that are very immediate, and you're going to spend a lot of time looking at them. So, manufacturers better put some effort into it in terms of at least, because like there are companies like Performance Samples who make these orchestral samples, and they have super minimal interfaces. Like they consciously put no money into it because they don't want to invest money into that. But they're still, I mean, super simple and minimal interfaces. They work just fine. That's not really an issue, and they play wonderfully. But yeah, there are some manufacturers out there who have interfaces that leave much to be desired.
The go-to library that I use for most of my orchestral stuff is stuff that I don't really hear people talk about much, but I just really like the interface. It's Sonus Core's The Orchestra. I don't think that they're the best samples in the world, but for me, not coming from an orchestral background, like I'm a rock, metal, and electronic music guy. So I'm still very much, I never was formally trained on how to arrange and stuff like that. So for me, I demo a lot of stuff. I want to like, oh, what does this sound like with a horn section playing it at this octave? Oh, what does it sound like with a string section playing it like this or something? And their interface allows me to like really demo a lot of things very quickly, and kind of come up with some like really quick arrangements, and then fairly easily tweak them later into like more specifically what I want. So their stuff, it's probably not for like the most deliberate person that already knows exactly how they want to do it, but for someone like me who likes to experiment with a bunch of different sounds and see how things fit together, man, their presets are like a dream to just like kind of call up and like hear a variation like that's a little bit more fleshed out, and then you can tweak it later. So I've kind of fallen in love with that as my go-to orchestral arranging tool. And it's probably because I'm not someone who's trained as much, but it works really well for me.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that. I mean, you clearly have a very good ear for hearing you know what works and what doesn't. I haven't checked out their stuff. Maybe I should reach out and see if they want to do any demos with me. But yeah, I know the company, but haven't played their stuff.
Yeah, I haven't seen anyone talk about them, but I use it on like every project, and I adore it. Can't get
Yeah,
enough of it.
yeah, they're definitely not a company name that sort of repeatedly comes out in conversations, but they're definitely, I mean, I'd say they're in the pool of the kind of maybe the bigger pool of you know developers
Yeah.
out there. Yeah. Um, Sort of touching on some of the points you talked about, I don't actually know what your like musical background is. It sounds to me like you're obviously somebody who learns through application, through practice, actually practically doing something. I'm that way, and I'm sure many people listening or not listening are as well. But is and I'm especially interested in this because listening to your music, you have such like elaborate and intricate complexity at the rhythm level, the harmonies, your melodies are fantastic. So I'm just wondering, like, where does it? Obviously, your inspiration, like bands, etc., are one of that component. Maybe we can touch on that after this, but what is like? Do you have any sort of formal training in like guitar, for example, or what is the kind of musical progression in terms of where you developed your all of this skill?
So I was just a amateur guitar player in high school. Tried to like form a couple heavy metal bands because I'm very into heavy metal music, and some of the people that I was playing music with at the end of high school, they were really into music theory. Like they were really into trying to like play really complex progressive music. Um, they, were into being able to name all their chords and knew every note on the fretboard. And like when you're an amateur guitar player, you use something called guitar tablature usually, which is a set of numbers that is not. It's more of like how to play it than knowing what you're playing. And to me, like I had all these people around me that were like interested in composition and knowing like how to speak to each other. And so I kind of got into that. I taught myself how to read music and notate midis and finale back when I was 20 years old or 19 years old. And that was really cool to me to like know how to articulate these things. Like I remember listening to this song and being like, "Oh man, I like love when Chris Cornell hits this note that he like always seems to land on." And my friend's like, "Oh, that's because he's landing on the major third." And I was like, "Oh." And landing on the major third in a minor progression, or he's doing like a Picardy third kind of a thing, is how some people would describe it. And like to me, that was really interesting to know more about what made the music tick. Like to understand, like, oh, I love this track. Like, what's the chord progression behind it? And I'm like, oh, cool. And I started to internalize the function of different chords, like functional harmony, right? Where, like, oh, this has like some tension to it. It makes me want to come back to the one. Oh, that's, it's either the fifth, the five chord, or the seven chord, or whatever. And I've kind of internalized all those things without taking music theory classes like in university. I've always had like a very analytical, scientific kind of brain. I went to school for molecular biology and was working in genetics labs before before I went full time into music. And so for me, like being able to break everything down was fantastic. And then rhythmically, sequencing drums was the hugest thing because I would hear a rhythm in my head and I'd like couldn't figure out exactly how to notate it. But when I had to when I had to sequence drums, I would mess around with a measure until I figured out, like, oh, that's what a dotted quarter note sounds like. That's what triplets sound like. I mean, I still get into fights with people in various bands that I'm in, like whether something's a dotted eighth note or a triplet. And I'm like, no, it's a triplet. And I just have that stuff so internalized from the practice of sequencing and arranging drums that like got my rhythmic knowledge super on point. And then I'm very into rhythmically progressive bands like Meshuggah and Periphery and bands that take rhythm to like sort of the next level, at least in terms of Western types of rhythms.
Yeah, I can definitely hear that. Yeah.
And that really allowed me to sort of like get that basis of like knowing like, oh, when the snare drum is on 2 and 4, it has this kind of feel, and it's when it's on 3 and 7, it has this kind of feel, and knowing exactly how those sorts of things interplay together gave me like a huge background in rhythm. In fact, I think I'm probably even stronger I am in rhythm than I am with harmony. Just sequencing and performing all sorts of rhythmically complex sort of music. But for me, it was, I hear this thing and it sounds awesome and it puts goosebumps on my arm when I'm listening to it. What are they doing musically? Like, what chords are they using? Where's the melody landing? You know, there's a band called Opeth that I love, and I noticed like all their solos have like this like heart-wrenching aspect to them. Like, oh, they end almost every solo, or at least Mike Ackerfeld does, on the second degree, and they just let that like end there and let that carry over into the extra into the next measure where they end on a 1 or something. And it's like, oh, they're adding a 9th on top of like every, you know, chord. It's a way to inflect emotion by adding dissonance and tension. And so I was always taking notes when I heard something that like really was evocative to me. Like, how is this constructed? Like all of my favorite Meshuggah rhythms. It's not the fact that they're doing odd time signatures. My favorite riffs that they do have tons of negative space in them. They leave room because that's where a groove breathes by having negative and positive space. When you fill up the entire bar with notes, like you're not going to have as strong of a groove to it because it's that interplay between consonance, dissonance, rhythm, positive and negative space. That's where music thrives, in my opinion. It's learning how they all interplay. And I probably have a slightly off kilter and kind of crappy sense of music theory knowledge because it's much more, it's not as trained as it is functional, like in a way, saying it in a way that makes sense to me, in a way that I can sort of communicate it to another musician. So, you know, sometimes I'll call a chord, you know, it should be a slash chord, but I'm like, oh yeah, I just come up with some insane stacked chord name for it because they're like, you know, it's just a 7th chord with a slash underneath it. I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was called that. So I, in some ways, I'm a little rough around the edges when it comes to my training, but I know enough to get myself in trouble theoretically.
Yeah, but you still have the desire to basically put it into words, like give it a name, define what it is. Because like for me, I don't even go to that length. Like I'm very much like, to me, stepping out of music slows down the process for me. Like if I speak in any sort of other language than the actual music, then it becomes pretty slow to me. And I did study music composition at a university level, but basically I you know, taught myself what I needed to get through the through the courses, and then I sort of basically forgot about it, not in terms of what the music could be doing, but in terms of what to call it to other people.
Sure.
So it's interesting that you have like this pure curiosity, like you have an emotional positive response to something you're hearing. You have a curiosity, then you have then you want to analyze and give it a name, and then you process it. Like when you write music, do you actually think about it in terms of the language of giving chords their precise names, or do you just write? Like, do you step into that kind of language?
Generally, the way my brain works now, I'm generally thinking of functions of chords, or but I will say I gave a talk at Music and Gaming Festival probably about 5 or 6 years ago. It was talking about like music composition techniques, the things that I thought people could like easily level up their ability to make music. And I talked about music theory, in that music theory is just a language, and it's an effective way to communicate with other musicians. So for you, if you're not collaborating with another musician, then it doesn't really matter what you call it. It doesn't matter that you know that it's called a minor chord. You just know that, like, oh, these, at least in the piano roll, they line up this way and they sound good. Because if it sounds good, it is good. It's only when you're at a band practice and like time is at a premium, and you call out like, all right, I want you to play a D7 and an F sharp major, and do a thing back and forth between a vamp between those two chords. And someone who knows those things can instantly go, okay, and you're saving a lot of time.
Yeah.
But if you're not communicating with other musicians, then coming up with the right names for things is almost functionally useless. It's just something I've done to internalize a little bit. It's just, I like to have names to go with things so I can describe it to other people, but I don't think that it's actually necessary to know any music theory or even know the names of the notes or the chords. In fact, I've collaborated with a bunch of musicians that couldn't tell you one thing about what they're making, but their mind is really good at hearing the notes and hearing what sounds good to them. And a lot of times, they'll do stuff that I never would have thought of doing because it's so like out there and non-functional, and it sounds amazing. And maybe I'm being boxed in a little bit too much, thinking about what a function of a chord should be, when I should just be messing around with an instrument or a keyboard or something and finding the good notes, the ones that just sound good.
Yeah, that was often the situation, because we had these sort of, we had to write, passages of music, short pieces of music at university in a certain style. And that would really grind my gears. I understood the point of the exercise, and I wasn't, shitting on it or anything. But, sometimes you had to do like a 4-part harmony in the style of this era, and etc. And I would do it, and it would be like, at first I thought, this is awesome, amazing, great. And then I do, because usually you had a starting point for the piece. You have certain notes put into the score already, and then you piece it together. It's basically like a mathematical exercise. You have you have a number of ways of doing it, but ultimately it's aiming to execute that thing in a certain way. And I would always like write the music that I wanted to hear, and write things that were interesting to me. And obviously, quite a few of those things would break the style of the era. And even though I understood the point of the exercise, I was just like, I have almost zero interest in writing something that I don't want to write. Like, then I'd just rather not write music. But yeah, it was very, it was an interesting exercise for multiple reasons. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And that's really the reason why I've probably let go of most of like notation scoring stuff, because I just don't communicate my musical ideas to almost anybody. It depends on, and most of the collaborations I've done, they don't use those kind of languages. Maybe at most, there's a chord suggestion, and then you just kind of do it. But definitely, if you're working at a professional level. Like if I were to be in a position where I got some live performers, I would definitely need a third party. What's the term? Basically,
Like
somebody who.
a notator.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a
Basically,
word for it. I can't think of it.
yeah, I'm blanking on it as well. But yeah, it's a job of its own. And to be fair, even top composers use these people
For
in
sure.
most cases. But I would definitely need somebody to, and they would have a pretty good time doing it as well because they could simply take the MIDI. I could export it with pretty decent resolution in terms of dynamics, etc. And they would have very good mock-up scores in terms of what the sound is supposed to be doing. And they can hear, okay, this is supposed to be happening, write the dynamics down in this and that sort of way. And I could do that stuff myself, but really slowly. Because obviously I
Me
would
too.
kind of have to reteach myself a lot of stuff. And I'm just frankly not very interested in it. But I find it awesome that some people are and that they're so good at it.
I think it's a completely independent art form. Being
Mm,
able to notate things in a way, you have to think about not just what the piece is doing, but like how to translate that in the most effective and efficient way to a player. I actually ran into someone at I was playing an event in Vancouver, and they came up to me after the show and they're like, "Oh, I've actually notated some of your stuff from stuff that was featured in the game." And I thought it was amazing. I just wanted to like pick their brain. And I was like, "Oh, I bet you had a lot of trouble with this part because that doesn't seem like it would go into sheet music very easily." Yeah, because it was tons of really wild pitch slides and stuff like that. But I thought it was I don't know, really humbling that somebody would like notate my work. Um, I don't know, maybe it's like a very old way of thinking of it, but like I guess we hold like, I don't know, sheet music or whatever in like a higher regard, like, oh, it's to be performed by other musicians. And I've always just thought of my stuff as like, rock music that like, I don't know, I just play loud stuff. And so the idea that it would be like held to this higher, almost academic standard is like kind of flattering or weird to me. Um, it's cool though. And I really do think that they're like the more I looked into notation and how complicated and thoughtful it has to be, like it really is its own independent art form, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's such an alien thing for a lot of modern musicians to see, like, because there's such a like legacy in putting music to that form. And there's also something because basically what the score is they abstract the core relative information of how your music comes together. Obviously, it doesn't have sound, but it kind of takes the essence of the not kind of it takes the um, you know uh, relative points between all the notes of your composition in this abstracted form and puts it on paper. And it can be pretty trippy to look at that. And it certainly
Oh yeah.
was for me. Every time I had to hand in work at the end of the semester, we had to have scores of the stuff we gave in, obviously. So it was always very strange for me to look at it and be like, well, there it is, and this is like the abstracted information of my composition. And yeah, it's makes you, and it's a purely visual format, obviously, so it makes you think, because music is obviously very auditive otherwise, but here is the physical only a visual representation of that music, which is can be trippy and interesting for people
Absolutely.
to see.
I
But have you?
mean, music is a language, right? And
Yeah.
when you think about like languages that we speak, there are so many different ones and different ways to do it.
Mm.
And it's very interesting to me, like that music can have several different languages too, like, and some of them fit into this sort of structure and others do not fit in there and they have to come up with new ways of doing it. And so it's it's just very interesting to me, and it does raise a lot of interesting questions about I don't know, how we communicate music and delivery formats and like different ways that music can exist, right? Because we don't have any actual recordings from before 1910 or something. So every piece of music before that exists as a piece of sheet music. I mean,
Yeah.
now we have recordings of them because people have recreated them, but they could only recreate them because of um, that music. And scholars like debate over how tracks are even supposed to sound. I think the idea is that like
Yeah.
Beethoven was supposed to be like 20 BPM faster for like some of his symphonies, and uh, it's so fast that it's unplayable. And so people think it's like a clerical mistake that someone copied it over wrong or something. And there's scholars that debate about like how is it supposed to actually sound. Um, and I guess like being a recording engineer and a composer and a mastering engineer, um, probably because I'm a control freak, I love having control over every aspect of a composition, and it sounds exactly the way I intend it to sound. I don't hand it off to someone else and then maybe get a little disappointed because the mix doesn't sound quite the way that I want it to be. Like I can be exactly as anal and have as much intent as I want. I'm sure that can be problematic in some ways, but it is such a freeing thing as an artist to have full control over what you're making. You can really just sculpt it, and it's I don't know. The first time that like I finished a recording that like sounded the way I wanted it in my head, when my recording skills finally got to the level where I was actually satisfied with the recording, because they sounded terrible for years. Like I was constantly getting a little bit better. When it finally sounded satisfying and big and huge, and it was like, oh, I can just make music now. I can make music that sounds the way I intend it to sound, and I don't have to like feel angry or sad that like it's listen to it with a with a, a nice ear, like pay attention to the composition, not the recording quality. I can just say, no, this is what I meant to do, and I did it.
Yeah. I think I still think I'm not there in terms
That's
like
okay.
I, I feel like I can catch glimpses of it every once in a while, but that's really the dream. And I think I can say that also with, like I said, with kind of relative perfection filter. Like I don't think I'm asking the impossible of myself. It's like this endless chase towards the perfection that is within my reach. But it's awesome to hear that you can actually get to that. And well, I mean, that's what I feel like when I listen to a bunch of your stuff. It's very much comes across very well, and I can
Thank
actually
you.
focus on the music itself and just enjoy it.
And it doesn't mean I don't have any regrets over certain recordings. My one record, the high end is a little like a little harsher than I want it to be, and the one album has the mid range that is a little honkier than I would prefer it to be these days. But like at the end of the day, music is an exercise in practice. Like you can't just listen super hard and figure it out. You have to continually make music to develop that practiced ear to know that frequency that's happening is going to be a problem down the line because you've had to solve it in 11 recordings in a row before that. And so you can practice mixing, like you will get better over time. It's the same thing with composition. It's the same thing with playing an instrument. It's like music is very much an exercise in practice. I do regret that like my guitar work, I feel like I'm at the level of practice where I'm fighting my biology and fighting tendinitis to get at a higher level. There's a little bit of like a arms race and heavy metal and guitar work where people just try to shred and outdo each other. And there's part of me that wants to keep up with that. And there's the other part of me that's like, you're just giving yourself tendinitis trying to do this. Like maybe just focus on writing a good song instead. But I do love shred guitar. It's fun.
Are you completely self-taught when it comes to the guitar, or?
Yes. However, I have performed and played in bands with a bunch of really phenomenal trained musicians. So I've been able to steal lots of little tricks and lots of like little advice and get mini lessons during band practice. Like, oh, how are you playing that? Show me how you do that. Like, oh, I never would have thought to do, that particular technique or something like that. Or they'll say like, oh, when you're picking, make sure that do you do down, down, up instead of like some other style of picking? And I've been able to steal a bunch of free lessons from performing with people who are absolutely phenomenal players. And so, in
So it
fact,
sounds like, no,
oh,
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, if you ever have the chance to like play with people who are better than you, like do it because you're just going to learn. And I mean, maybe that's what this podcast is about, right? Is like you becoming the best musician you can by hearing uh, what other people are doing and internalizing some of that stuff. I internalized a ton of stuff from the people that I collaborated with, more so in a band setting, but like talking is another way to do that exact same thing.
Yeah. It's although it can feel a bit shitty and crappy, but if you are surrounded by people who are better than you, that's a very good place to be. It doesn't massage your ego in a pleasant way, but it means that you at least have the opportunity to learn if you're willing to, be humble in the face of that. But it sounds like you've really leveraged your peers really well, which sounds like, at least in my experience, you've done that at a pretty exceptional level, because you mentioned your friends who were into music theory and you listened to what they were talking about and you kind of took that in like a sponge. So it sounds like you've really squeezed, the juice out of your, peers.
Well, for me, um, when I'm around other people who are doing amazing things, and I know that I can't do that, it's a very motivating for me to like. I find that being a little uncomfortable and being around uh, peers that are operating at a slightly higher level than you is a crucible to like get you to motivate yourself to practice and learn. Where like, oh, everyone around me is uh, able to just name off chords and they can all talk to each other. It's like, oh, like I feel like I'm left behind. I got to learn how to do that, because I feel very uncomfortable when I'm like the worst person in the group, right? And so for me, it's very motivating uh, to be around that because it pushes me like, oh, I have stuff I need to work on. I have a guitar player that I play with that is absurdly good, and he gives me these riffs to play where I'm like, I sound terrible playing him because he's such a phenomenal player. For him, it's not a big deal, but I'm like, man, the stretch that's going on and whatever. And so it forces me to go home. And the next practice I show up, I don't want to look like a jerk. Like I want to show up and like, yeah, I got this. So for me, it's very motivating because I don't want to look like an asshole. Um, and
But it sounds like you have a very healthy relationship with the ego, because I talk about the ego in terms of, people get very latched on to the negatives of the ego, and I think for a good reason, because obviously it can, you know, drive you into being a horrible person to be around, but simultaneously it's the ego that says, I could do this, I could create this, I could pursue this. It's kind of this inner drive that pushes you forward. And if you harness that, if you manage it correctly, then it can be used to a tremendous degree. But it sounds like you have this. Obviously, when somebody is better than you, it kind of pulls you in a like tugs at you or tugs on you in a slight way. But you take that and you transform it into something resourceful and constructive, instead of trying to shit on other people, or and it doesn't sound like you just, it's all about just wanting to be better than someone else, but it's rather this stimulus that you take and you turn it into something positive.
it it helps a tiny bit to be just a little bit competitive. Obviously, it can get a little out of hand and lead to some poor attitudes and stuff like that. But for me, I like I don't know, maybe I would call it almost like when you're playing a sports game, and it's your challenge. You know, you're playing a game of hockey or whatever, like, and someone scores on you, and you're like, I want to score on them. You know, it's for me. I don't view music as a sport, but I find that like a little bit of that friendly, like drive to push each other to the best is like can be a little bit healthy. Because sometimes left to my own devices, I'll just, you know, I don't know, kind of flounder a little bit and just do the things that are comfortable around me. And being around other people who are really good make me uncomfortable in a very good way. I think everyone should be a little uncomfortable sometimes. And because that's how you get better. That's those moments, those teachable learning moments where you get to come face to face with your failures and your flaws. And I guess it can be very difficult to sort of keep a good head around it. And I guess I've been fortunate enough to like uh, be around positive people who are interested in uh, collaborating and teaching and becoming better themselves. And it's a it's definitely a tricky balance. I think I often say that like my greatest superpower as a composer isn't that I am like naturally the best musician. It's I'm a good reviser because I can tell when I'm doing something good and I can tell when I'm doing something bad, and keep a really objective, level head about it. And maybe it just comes from like my scientific background or something like that. But I try to like always stay objective. Like if I think it's good, enough other people over the years have also said that like, oh, that thing you did, that's my favorite part. And I'm like, good, that's my favorite part. I know that I can trust me. Um, and like, oh, that I guess learning to be able to trust yourself is so impossible for 99% of musicians that I've met. But I feel like that's my superpower is I can trust myself to know when I'm doing something good and when I'm not doing something good.
Yeah. Well, I think if you can figure out just like that's a basic principle of are you making progress or not? And if you
Yeah.
focus on that, no matter how small those steps may be or whatever it is in whatever aspect in your life, then it's a recipe for success eventually because you're moving
Right.
into the right direction. So,
Failure is very much a big part of the process. You know, if you're not feeling good about your work, like that is part of it. Unfortunately, like there is no getting around. No one's gonna make award-winning things on the first try. Like it is very much an exercise in practice. And I've been fortunate enough now that I can get to a point where I really like a lot of the material I'm making. I still have a lot to learn, and I could be doing a lot better. But I'm always listening. I'm always trying to stand on the shoulders of more giants, and learn from them. Um, and I mean, yeah, I feel like the Borg. I don't know if you're a Star Trek guy, but I'm kind of
not as
everything. I'm
much,
trying
but
to take a little bit from, and so I can form my own like collective consciousness of like making great music. Uh,
yeah. This is kind of because I'm obviously we're coming closer to the 3 hour mark, so
oh,
I'm
sure.
gonna try and cram in
Wrap it up.
a couple of things in here. But this is kind of a reoccurring question that I ask the guests, um, which is again another theory of mine, which is that creative people seem to be able to retain their creativity from their childhood into their adulthood. So, however it is that they go through their life as they grow up, they manage to, keep the flame alive somehow, keep the creative spark going. Because I think some people who are creative, unfortunately, get squashed along the way, or a number of things can happen, but they sort of uh, lose touch with that inner creative spark. So, do you feel like, first of all, Do you feel like that applies to you, that you were a creative kid and then you sort of managed to somehow retain it into your adulthood? And if so, how did you manage to do that?
The way that I've always operated, and this hasn't always gone super well, but those shower thoughts, or when you're doing a long drive, or you're on a bike ride and you're not listening to a podcast, you're just in your own thoughts and the things that play in your head constantly. For me, I would have those and I would obsess over them. It's the only thing I could think about for like months on end. So when I was making video game music, or covering video game music, all I could think about was like, oh man, I really want to do this cover of like the Metroid Kraid's Lair or something like that, and like this is how I'm going to do it. And I would think about it for like the whole month, and it's all I could think about. And then I got into chiptune music, and all of a sudden, all I could do was think about chiptune music for months on end. I would like look up all sorts of tutorials online, and I knew that that's where I had to put my energy into, because it's all I could think about in my on those free moments where you're not thinking about anything else. What kept coming into my head was that. And then for a while, I got into something called Vocaloid. I don't know if you're familiar with that technology.
Yep.
I went to a Hatsune Miku concert. I thought it was incredible. It was the next big thing. And it was all I could think about. I taught myself holographic projection and motion capture technology back in like 2017, which was like much harder to do than the VTuber stuff that's out now, which is pretty much the same thing. I was like using Homebrew Connect software, like Microsoft Connect, to do motion tracking data on Japanese freeware and models that were on DeviantArt. And this is all I could think about for like months straight. And unfortunately, the Vocaloid technology, compositionally, I don't think it's there yet. I found it very frustrating to work with, and I could never make anything with it that I thought sounded amazing. I could only make things that sounded pretty good, and that wasn't really doing it for me. But I had ideas for an entire stage show based around Vocaloid and holographic projections, and all I could think about for months.
That's actually one of the questions I had, because I in an interview I heard you mention that you were working on an album of that, yeah. But I don't think I ever saw that. I don't know if anything came out in that style, but it's good that you touched on that on the side at least.
I was so excited about it. It's all I wanted to do, and so in all my life, I've been very successful just chasing that thing that I spent all day thinking about. And then after that, I wanted to make really modern, Mick Gordon style Doom 2016 modern metal music, and it was like, this is what I have to do. So I went down that rabbit hole, and I think I'm almost there. I did this cover of BFG Division from Doom 2016 that like I made it almost like as perfectly accurate as possible, except I made it from scratch, and it was like, all right, I think I could do this. I learned so much along the way, and because it was all I could think about. And then when I went to make the video for that, I taught myself motion tracking, virtual environment video work, where you essentially insert green screen footage with motion tracking into Unreal Engine, because that's all I could think about for months. And so I get hyperfixated, and I just know that that's the thing I have to do. I have mostly been lucky with it. Things like Vocaloid haven't quite worked out, but that's the only thing I know to keep doing in terms of like chasing that creativity. Is there that thing that you can't stop thinking about every day? That's the thing you got to do. Now, that might not be the best career advice, but that's my creative advice, because there's probably some things I could have done that have been way more efficient. I've just been very lucky to have been obsessed with the right topics at the right time. That's why I had the right skills to do game music when that was emerging in the 2010s and stuff like that with chiptunes. But There's a little bit of luck, but if creativity is the thing that you are struggling to figure out where to go, you just have to do that thing that you can't stop thinking about in those shower thoughts. Uh, Things where you're not staring at your phone, going through social media, just those moments by yourself.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you kind of leaned into your kind of obsession as a strength. Like, because you said like, is this good overall career advice? So in that sense, I think it is, because that's kind of your strength seems to be this. And I was gonna, I mean, I have so many questions which we're not gonna get into, but one of the things, like, it's very clear to me that you are extremely detail oriented. And when I listen to your music, it like I know all the nooks and crannies are supposed to be there. Uh, and it's that kind of, and oftentimes obsessiveness is used in this sort of a negative light. But again, I think it's a superpower, and it's something that people who don't have a deep drive and passion towards something, they don't understand it very well. Like, they think it's extreme to go super hard into something, but I think it's only extreme when it when there's dissonance between that obsession and something else. So it's like, whether it's a negative or positive comes down to the kind of the total tally, I guess. Which I might use this as a kind of a segue into maybe briefly touching on your personal life balance, because you obviously are very detail oriented, and like you said, you can get super obsessive in a positive way, in this context at least, with these kind of things. So have you found that hyper focus has it been sort of challenging to pair with the rest of your life, like your personal life balance? And you obviously, you don't have to go into tremendous detail in terms of this, as obviously much as you want, but has that been like, has it sort of collided with other areas of your life, or have you found has finding good balance has that always been easy for you?
The one thing I will say is that um, since the things I would follow and get hyper focused on were fairly niche, whichever one of those we decided on.
Niche.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the people around me that I was friends with, often, at least locally in my home, there was almost nobody I could talk to about these things. So let's say I'm into Vocaloid, and like there are no other musicians in my area that even know what it is. That's not 100% true, but it's like mostly true. And nobody who can speak about it in a level of detail that like is a satisfying collaborative conversation. Um, and it was the same thing when I got into chiptune music. Similarly with video game music, like there was my bandmate Chris, and we still play in a game music band called Arm Cannon together. But he was the only other person I knew that was like into video game music. And then the other people that we got to be in that band, they were just like, I don't know, Mega Man's cool, I guess. I never really cared about it, but I just want to be in a band with other musicians who I think are talented. And then we started to see some success with the band. They're like, all right, I guess I'm more on board, with this. And that's not to take anything away from them, but I've had a lot of difficulty relating these ideas and being able to like fully geek out with other people at a really fundamental level where they understand things. And there's two places where I went and like were able to solve that. Is online communities. Now, it probably led to me being chronically online to a problematic way because there was nobody else who I could talk to about, the cool effect used in Dr. Cossack level 3 and 4 in Mega Man 4, the tremolo effect happening on Pulse 1. Like that's not something I can talk to just somebody about at the bar. Um, but I could go online, and then also places like MagFest, the Music and Gaming Festival, like would have other composers and other musicians who were like into that level of detail where you could geek out. I remember hanging out with Jake Kaufman, and he was doing samples with his voice from Blades of Steel, but he was inserting the correct level of like bit compression or bit crushing from the DCPM channel on the NES. And like these are interactions that like you can't have. So the main consequence was it is I would tell people, oh, I'm in a band, and they're like, oh, what do you do? And I was like, oh, I cover music from video games. And I had people to my face. It was a different time. It was like probably 2006, 2007. They're like, that's a really dumb idea. And and that's something you might say to somebody in a comment section online, but like people would tell that to me to my face. Or when I was really into chiptune music, I would play it in my car and I'd drive around my friends, and they'd be like, don't put on any of that stupid chiptune music anymore. And it's just like, it was very difficult for me to relate with people around me. I kind of had to just go like myself and live in my own world and trust that it would be okay and make stuff for me. And it's worked out, but to say it was easy, it wasn't always easy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the problem with hyper obsessing about weird niche interests, is that like there won't always be people around you to follow you and support you. And it's not that they won't support you, it's they won't understand what you're doing, and they'll just be, they don't even understand, like you're speaking another language. When I tell people that I make music on a Nintendo Game Boy, they're like, what does that even mean? And it turns the whole conversation. That's part of the reason I did the TED Talk, was because I wanted people to understand at least a little bit this interest that I've been hyper obsessed about for the last 5 years. And like, hey, there's all these amazing things happening. Like, let me share them with you, because, oh my God, I can't talk about this with anybody.
Yeah. Well, it can be very tough because some people just don't have they don't have anything in their life where they put that level of detail and consideration into something, or they don't look at it with such detail. You know, things are sort of very superficial and blobbish, I guess. I don't know if that's not a word, but yeah, I mean, but you made the most of it in the sense that you went out there online and you seeked out your community, and obviously now you've probably have a lot more of those people in your life through these festivals and a lot of
it's
this
really
stuff.
been amazing. Like when I go to an event like MagFest, I have literally 100 or 200 friends there that are either people I've collaborated with or met before, or sometimes they're fans that I've gotten to know a little bit. I'm bad with names, so it's like problematic sometimes. It can be overwhelming, but I don't know, I don't get to geek out in my regular everyday life. My girlfriend's been amazing. She lets me geek out all the time, and she's here for it. And and I let her geek out about the stuff that she's super into. Like she tells me about all the paleontology stuff and all the research papers that are coming out, and she's so excited about it. And she's like, I don't know how to talk about this stuff with my friends. And part of the reason we get along so well is I have a science background, so I understand some of the scientific stuff that's going on with her, level of interest, and she hung out with a bunch of people who are in the video game development and video game like composing scene. So she actually knows a fair bit about that stuff. We actually met at MagFest. So
Nice.
she knows enough about that stuff, and I can just geek out to my heart's content to her. God bless her. But she gets to geek out to me, and she's told me several times that a lot of the stuff that we talk about together, she's like, I've never been able to like tell people, they don't care or understand at the same level. And it can be tricky. You kind of have to do things for you and hope other people care.
Yeah. No, but that's awesome. You found, well, several avenues of being yourself and just being involved with the things that you care about.
But I've been lucky. A lot of people, I struggled for a long time with that. So it is okay if you feel that and you're struggling to find the right people to be around who are supportive and into that, because it can be tricky sometimes. So just keep at it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no. And again, you did the right thing. Like you stuck to who you are and what you're interested in, and it took some time, and you had to hang out online in God knows what kind of forums. But
They're
yeah,
all great
it,
forms.
yeah. I'm just doing bad jokes over here.
Yeah, it's fine.
But yeah, the dark depths of the internet, and yeah, I mean, you met people there, and then eventually these events, and a part of that journey is every time you want to be yourself, there's a portion of that journey that's going to be lonely. Like if you do, especially if you spent most of your life or a portion of your life trying to be someone who you're not, or portraying to be someone who you're not, and then you do a 180, or you actually start to be more of who you actually want to be, that's gonna alienate you, and you're probably gonna lose some of the people who were your friends. But if you want to move into something that looks more like you, then you have to be honest with yourself, and just stick with it. And a portion of that journey is going to be lonely, but eventually, if you stick with it and keep building and connecting, then you're going to find yourself in a different place eventually.
Yeah. And I guess I've been lucky enough to like have enough success with some of the stuff where people are like, I don't understand what you do, but you see people seem to like it. So like we're very supportive of you doing that, because like it's okay to not understand every, thing that's out there. And we've also grown up a little bit. I think people can be a little edgier when they're younger, and
Yeah.
um but now that we're a little bit older, it's just like, oh, we love and support everything that you want to do, even if I don't understand it at all, because clearly you know what you're doing. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like growing up.
yeah, I'm reaching the old man stage of my career now. I
Not
just need to
quite yet.
figure out how to get to that next level of success. But I mean, we're all working, right?
Yeah. Well, it's coming. I'm
I
sure.
hope so. I hope so. If it doesn't, it's fine. Like sounds weird to say, but like if I had to go get a regular full-time job and just make music as hobbyist work for the rest of my life, I would be totally fine with that, because I've been to 5 different continents and played shows. I've been on tour, but like almost everywhere in North America, and I have gotten to do so many amazing things that you have to know like whether the grind is worth it, whether um it, and for me, I can make music just for me if I need to. And
Yeah.
if other people want to come along for the ride, if the career is there, if the game industry is at its venture capitalist, uh, maximum, so people can actually pay me for work, then awesome. But if not, it's okay. It's gonna be okay, because at the end of the day, I'm always gonna make stuff for me. Um, and if that's my full-time job, cool. If it's not my full-time job, I'll still do it.
Yeah. I think that's good. And I think that's probably, I think paradoxically, that's probably what is going to make it so that you will be working on music with other people, because it's the component of not, you'll still be writing music. Like same for me, I'll be writing music no matter what. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
care what my conditions are. I don't care. Like it's so fulfilling for me alone that I'll keep doing it, and that keeps you in the game, and that keeps you improving. So I think sort of paradoxically, even if that's enough for you, it's probably the reason why you'll end up still making
I
music with
hadn't thought
other
about
people.
that. That's actually really interesting. um, I'll think about that. That's it. I like that.
Cool, cool. And yeah, I mean, like I said, you'll be fine. I think the laws of physics need to break in order for you to not find projects in the future, but
It's a competitive industry, and
sure.
there are a lot of really talented and really hungry, and a lot of them are very young um, composers out there. And part of me like pushing myself to learn and make my production so good is that like I need to be able to make music that no one else can make. Because if I'm just making something that some other person could do, one of 30 other people who are good or even great, like then what's to stop from some company from hiring them? But if I can make music that only I can make, then then they have no choice but to hire me if they want it. I don't know. Hopefully it's good enough that they want to hire me for it. But I like to my goal, at least for my new record, is sort of like make the music that only you can make. And you could draw upon all these influences that like, this person, has this sort of style or this production style or whatever. But like it's that's I guess what artistry is, right? Like any good artist, like you get them for their signature sound or their signature artwork or whatever it is, like the art that only they will make. Because otherwise you just get someone else.
That's kind of you answered my second to last question, which was going to be what's your definition of an artist? But I guess you
Yeah.
kind of did that already.
Well, it can be tricky because I'm always taking notes, right? And it's very easy to be like, oh, I want to make music like AC/DC or something, or just a random example. But like AC/DC already exists. So you have to find what you like about AC/DC and apply it to your own vision. Um, and hopefully that's original enough and pervasive enough that like the people latch onto it and people resonate with it. Um, it can be tricky. Uh, like trying to draw from inspirations and also be wholly original because at the end of the day work is it can be derivative, and so
Mhm.
but I think I'm combining from enough disparate sources together that hopefully what I'm making won't be imitated by anybody else. That's my hope anyways.
Yeah, that's the only thing an artist can really do because it's exactly like you said. Otherwise, you're simply replicating something, and guess what? AC/DC already exists, and they do AC/DC better than anyone else can do. So it's
Exactly.
like it's
Such an odd
everyone.
choice for me to pick that one, but
Yeah,
like
yeah,
whatever.
sure. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is, but it's like everyone else is already taken. So the only option you really have is to do your thing and do it as well as you possibly can, and keep refining it and keep working on it. But yeah, all right. Final question, because we've
Yeah.
already passed the 3 hour mark, and
Thank
I
you
want
for
to.
letting me rant, I guess.
No, no, I
I
mean,
apologize for
no,
taking a little
like,
too
don't
long.
get me wrong. I could do this for another 3 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm sure you have other things to get to, and also, well, maybe somebody listens to. I actually listen to quite a few, 4 or 5 hour podcasts quite often, but yeah, I guess hopefully we can do a round two at some point, and
Sure,
I've
sure.
got 1,000 questions we didn't get to. Because luckily we had enough, stuff coming up sort of naturally. But this is a new question that I'm trying to incorporate here as a finisher. I don't know if this kind of is going to work or not, but
Hit me.
um, if you could instantaneously send a message to everyone's smartphone in the world right now, that would they would have to open. You can't open the phone without seeing it in the front screen. You could put whatever you want on there. What would you put there? And this goes out to every single person in the world who has a smartphone.
Um, I would probably say uh, either be kind or don't forget to be kind. Um, the at least the view on the internet and television, and I guess all media that we uh, have been consuming, at least in America, um, has sort of been reaching this like fever pitch of anxiety and worry and anger, and I've seen a lot of excessive vitriol. Some of it's very deserved. People should be angry about a lot of things, but I think that like don't forget to like be kind. I think people could take a little bit of extra time to sort of like recenter their emotional health and like do something or say something really nice to somebody. Because sometimes when I look out in the world, I just see so much chronic anger and sadness. And I feel like being kind and saying the nice thing to someone makes such an emotional difference in someone's day. You know, if I get an email or a message from a fan that's just like, "Oh, I really love your work," and it's just like, "Oh my God, my entire day is just brightened." Um, while even on a bad day, and that sort of thing. Like, there's so many amazing musicians that I like follow online and stuff like that, and they post stuff, and sometimes there's like no response or whatever because it's tough to get eyeballs these days or whatever. It's like, but if you take a moment and you like say something nice, like this is really cool, like you're just gonna give them, I don't know, that fire to like continue creating. Or even a service worker who's having a tough day at their job, like they're working at Taco Bell or something, and their last 5 customers have been real crappy and they're in a bad mood, and you're like, hey, thank you so much or whatever. It just adds a I feel like the emotional well-being of the world, at least that I perceive, like could use just a little bit more. And I know that's not a fix for any of the issues that are on this planet. But I do think that uh, if people are a little happier, they'll have a little less vitriol to sort of like shout at the world. And maybe that will make it a more like pleasant place to exist in. I have to exist in the world. You have to exist in the world. I'd like to see just a little bit. There's a whole conversation about something called toxic positivity. I'm not trying to do that, but I just taking a little moment to make someone's day by being extra kind in a moment where you don't have to be is really that's what I want to give into the world. That's the energy I want to put in the world, and I don't usually do it often enough.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's reminds me of I don't know what's up with the Lord of the Rings references today, but I think
They're
Gandalf
the best
says
references.
yeah, Gandalf says something like when he talks about Saruman, that he thinks it's great power that um, I don't know, keeps the darkness at bay. But Gandalf says that he finds that it's the small acts of kindness that actually keep the darkness at bay, and it's actually a profoundly brilliant piece of wisdom. Because at a surface level, it seems so like, woo woo and whatever else, but it's so powerful when people see that strangers do something small for them and take them into consideration and look at them and think of them and what's the word, acknowledge them as individuals just like they are, and they have also difficult things, and take energy out of their day to do something kind and nice to someone else. It it can change, like you said, it can change a person's entire view of the world. Like suddenly
Yeah.
not everybody sucks and the world isn't a dark, grim, selfish place. So
The world will give you infinity reasons to be sad if you go to look for them. Because there's never, and I don't mean to say it in a defeatist way, there will never not be like horrible injustices being served. constantly. And, whether it's a news media or, Twitter or whatever, will give you a million reasons to be mad per day. And like that, it's actually, to tie it back to music composition, uh, depression has been the toughest thing for my creative output, where that that soul crushing like feeling makes me not want to make anything. And it's mostly been about emotionally centering myself and getting back into a really productive place. That's why I couldn't, take advantage of that one job that happened after my mom died, where they asked me, it was a big video game franchise, and they were like, we want you to do a demo track for us to, for this big project. And I wish I could have done it, but I just couldn't do it because uh, the world was just too much. And so coming up with just like good, solid support group with my friends locally and with my partner, and finding ways to be happy even when there's so much sorrow, is like helps me emotionally center myself so then I can create. Because when the world is awful and I'm depressed, I just can't do it.
Yeah.
It's tough. I don't blame anyone. Struggling to find that balance is not an enviable task, and I don't know how to tell you to do it. But just being a little bit more kind than you need to be to someone else is a good first step.
Yeah, it can go a long way, especially for someone who's in that dark place. And maybe this is something we can delve deeper into hopefully in a future episode someday.
Hey, maybe. I really have enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise, it's been my pleasure. And yeah, like I said, you're not only, I mean, there are like three tiers here. You're not only one of my favorite chiptune artists, and you're at the very top of like this sort of hard hitting chiptune for sure. But especially, like, I haven't been listening to your music for a while now. I'm pretty bad at listening to music, period. I try and do more of it, but as you know, like, so much of my time and my ears go to my music. So
Right,
I
of
don't
course.
really have the space or the time to listen to other stuff. But I revisited a lot of your work, and I was like for example, the track you have on Lunaria. Let
Yep.
me check the name. The Collision event. That's like top
Ah,
tier composition. Like, so
that's my favorite track I ever made.
really,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I'm
I
because
told you earlier in the interview, someone came up to me and was like, "Oh, that part there, that was amazing." And I was like, "I thought that was the best thing I ever did." So the fact that like I can trust me, so thank you. I think that's the best track I ever made.
yeah, and I would need to sit down and think about it for a long time, consider all the music that I've ever heard, but I would not be surprised if that track was easily in the top 10, like, out of all the music, because it is really like a masterpiece,
Thank you so
stellar stuff.
much.
So it's been my honor and pleasure to talk with you, and yeah, like I said, I could go for another 6 hours easily, but we'll probably reserve something for a future time. Maybe revisit this after some time
Awesome.
has passed, and after you release some new music. Can't wait to hear how that's going to turn out.
I'm excited to share stuff with the world, and thank you for asking me about some of this stuff because they aren't really stories that I tell much, or not things that people think to ask me so much about. A lot of it has just been, living inside my head as a solo journey. Um, so I very much appreciate you asking some of these questions. Because that some of these topics are things I think very deeply about, but they're not conversations that I have very often.
Yeah, well, that tends to be the case, and a part of this podcast is to kind of get that out there because so many people benefit from. There are so many people like yourself that have similar ambitions and similar issues and problems and stuff you're trying to work through. And so yeah, we really should be getting more of these experiences and lessons learned out there. And this is my small part of trying to do that, because there are so many.
I think you're doing good work.
Awesome. Well, that's very encouraging to hear. I'll try and do my best.
That's all we can do.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for staying up late. I'm glad we were able to sort it out. Thank you for being flexible.
No worries. Again, my pleasure, completely. So cool. I'm gonna head over to have some sleep at this point, and I'll
Awesome.
talk to you. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. I hope you have a great night.
You too, man.
Bye.